8. Solo was busily checking readouts from gauges and dials in the hold area. Occasionally he would pass a small box across various sensors, study the result, and cluck with pleasure. "You can stop worrying about your Imperial friends," he told Luke and Ben. "They'll never be able to track us now. Told you I'd lose 'em." Kenobi might have nodded briefly in response, but he was engaged in explaining something to Luke. "Don't everybody thank me at once," Solo grunted, slightly miffed. "Anyway, navigation computer calculates our arrival at Alderaan orbit at 0200. I'm afraid after this little adventure I'll have to forge a new registration." He returned to his checking, passing in front of a small circular table. The top was covered with small squares lit from beneath, while computer monitors were set into each side. Tiny three-dimensional figures were projected above the tabletop from various squares. Chewbacca sat hunched over one side of the table, his chin resting in massive hands. His great eyes glowing and facial whiskers wrinkled upward, he gave every sign of being well pleased with himself. At least, he did until R2-D2 reached up with a stubby clawed limb across from him and tapped his own computer monitor. One of the figures walked abruptly across the board to a new square and stopped there. An expression of puzzlement, then anger, crossed the Wookiee's face as he studied the new configuration. Glaring up and over the table, he vented a stream of abusive gibberish on the inoffensive machine. R2 could only beep in reply, but 3PO soon interceded on behalf of his less eloquent companion and began arguing with the hulking anthropoid. "He executed a fair move. Screaming about it won't help you." Attracted by the commotion, Solo looked back over his shoulder, frowning slightly. "Let him have it. Your friend's way ahead anyhow. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee." "I can sympathize with that opinion, sir," 3PO countered, "but there is principle at stake here. There are certain standards any sentient creature must hold to. If one compromises them for any reason, including intimidation, then one is abrogating his right to be called intelligent." "I hope you'll both remember that," Solo advised him, "when Chewbacca's pulling the arms off you and your little friend." "Besides that, however," 3PO continued without missing a beat, "being greedy or taking advantage of someone in a weakened position is a clear sign of poor sportsmanship." That elicited a beep of outrage from R2, and the two robots were soon engaged in violent electronic argument, while Chewbacca continued jabbering at each in turn, occasionally waving at them through the translucent pieces waiting patiently on the board. Oblivious to the altercation, Luke stood frozen in the middle of the hold. He held an activated lightsaber in position over his head. A low hum came from the ancient instrument while Luke lunged and parried under Ben Kenobi's instructive gaze. As Solo glanced from time to time at Luke's awkward movements, his lean features were wrinkled with smugness. "No, Luke, your cut should flow, not be so choppy," Kenobi instructed gently. "Remember, the Force is omnipresent. It envelopes you as it radiates from you. A Jedi warrior can actually feel the Force as a physical thing." "It is an energy field, then?" Luke inquired. "It is an energy field and something more," Kenobi went on almost mystically. "An aura that at once controls and obeys. It is a nothingness that can accomplish miracles." He looked thoughtful for a moment. "No one, not even the Jedi scientists, were able to truly define the Force. Possibly no one ever will. Sometimes there is as much magic as science in the explanations of the Force. Yet, what is a magician but a practicing theorist? Now let's try again." The old man was hefting a silvery globe about the size of a man's fist. It was covered with fine antennae, some as delicate as those of a moth. He flipped it toward Luke and watched as it halted a couple of meters away from the boy's face. Luke readied himself as the ball circled him slowly, turning to face it as it assumed a new position. Abruptly, it executed a lightning-swift lunge, only to freeze about a meter away. Luke failed to succumb to the feint, and the ball soon backed off. Moving slowly to one side in an effort to get around the ball's force sensors, Luke drew the saber back, preparing to strike. As he did so, the ball darted in behind him. A thin pencil of red light jumped from one of the antennae to the back of Luke's thigh, knocking him to the deck even as he was bringing his saber around. Too late. Rubbing at his tingling, sleeping leg, Luke tried to ignore the burst of accusing laughter from Solo. "Hocus-pocus religions and archaic weapons are no substitute for a good blaster at your side," the pilot sneered. "You don't believe in the Force?" asked Luke, struggling back to his feet. The numbing effect of the beam wore off quickly. "I've been from one end of this galaxy to the other," the pilot boasted, "and I've seen a lot of strange things. Too many to believe there couldn't be something like this Force. Too many to think that there could be some such controlling one's actions. I determine my destiny, not some half-mystical energy field." He gestured toward Kenobi. I wouldn't follow him so blindly if I were you. He's a clever old man, full of simple tricks and mischief. He might be using you for his own ends." Kenobi only smiled gently, then turned back to face Luke. "I suggest you try it again, Luke," he said soothingly. "You must try to divorce your actions from conscious control. Try not to focus on anything concrete, visually or mentally. You must let your mind drift. Drift. Only then can you use the Force. You have to enter a state in which you act on what you sense, not on what you think beforehand. You must cease cognition, relax, stop thinking, let yourself drift. Free. Free." The old man's voice had dropped to a mesmerizing buzz. As he finished, the chrome bulb darted at Luke. Dazed by Kenobi's hypnotic tone, Luke didn't see it charge. It's doubtful he saw much of anything with clarity, but as the ball neared, he whirled with amazing speed, the saber arcing up and out in a peculiar fashion. The red beam that the globe emitted was neatly deflected to one side. Its humming stopped and the ball bounced to the deck, all animation gone. Blinking as if coming awake from a short nap, Luke stared in absolute astonishment at the inert remote. "You see, you can do it," Kenobi told him. "One can teach only so much. Now you must learn to admit the Force when you want it, so that you can learn to control it consciously." Moving to one side, Kenobi took a large helmet from behind a locker and walked over to Luke. Placing the helmet over his head effectively eliminated the boy's vision. "I can't see," Luke muttered, turning around and forcing Kenobi to step back out of the range of his dangerously waving saber. "How can I fight?" "With the Force," old Ben explained. "You didn't really see the Seeker when it went for your legs the last time, and yet you parried its beam. Try to let that sensation flow within you again." "I can't do it," Luke moaned. "I'll get hit again." "Not if you let yourself trust you," Kenobi insisted, none too convincingly for Luke. "This is the only way to be certain you're relying wholly on the Force." Noticing that the skeptical Corellian had turned to watch, Kenobi hesitated momentarily. It did Luke no good to have the self-assured pilot laugh every time a mistake was made, but coddling the boy would do him no good either, and there was no time for it anyway. "Throw him in and hope he floats," Ben instructed himself firmly. Bending over the chrome globe, he touched a control at its side. Then he tossed it straight up. It arced toward Luke. Breaking in mid-fall, the ball plummeted stone-like toward the deck. Luke swung the saber at it. While it was a commendable try, it wasn't nearly fast enough. Once again, the little antenna glowed. This time, the crimson needle hit Luke square on the seat of his pants. Though it wasn't an incapacitating blow, it felt like one, and Luke let out a yelp of pain as he spun, trying to strike his invisible tormentor. "Relax," old Ben urged him. "Be free. You're trying to use your eyes and ears. Stop predicting and use the rest of your mind." Suddenly the youth stopped, wavering slightly. The Seeker was still behind him. Changing direction again, it made another dive and fired. Simultaneously, the lightsaber jerked around, as accurate as it was awkward in its motion, to deflect the bolt. This time, the ball didn't fall motionless to the deck. Instead, it backed up 3 meters and remained there, hovering. Aware that the drone of the Seeker remote no longer assaulted his ears, a cautious Luke peeked out from under the helmet. Sweat and exhaustion competed for space on his face. "Did I?" "I told you you would," Kenobi informed him with pleasure. "Once you start to trust your inner self, there'll be no stopping you. I told you there was much of your father in you." "I'd call it luck," snorted Solo as he concluded his examination of the readouts. "In my experience, there is no such thing as luck, my young friend. Only highly favorable adjustments of multiple factors to incline events in one's favor." "Call it what you like," the Corellian sniffed indifferently. "But good against a mechanical remote is one thing. Good against a living menace is another." As he was speaking, a small telltale light on the far side of the hold had begun flashing. Chewbacca noticed it and called out to him. Solo glanced at the board, then informed his passengers. "We're coming up on Alderaan. We'll be slowing down shortly and going back under light speed. Come on, Chewie." Rising from the game table, the Wookiee followed his partner toward the cockpit. Luke watched them depart, but his mind wasn't on their imminent arrival at Alderaan. It was burning with something else, something that seemed to grow and mature at the back of his brain as he dwelt on it. "You know," he murmured, "I did feel something. I could almost see the outlines of the remote." He gestured at the hovering device behind him. Kenobi's voice when he replied was solemn. "Luke, you've taken the first step into a larger universe." Dozens of humming, buzzing instruments lent the freighter's cockpit the air of a busy hive. Solo and Chewbacca had their attention locked on the most vital of those instruments. Steady. Stand by, Chewie. Solo adjusted several manual compensators. Ready to go sublight. Ready? Cut us in, Chewie. The Wookiee turned something on the console before him. At the same time, Solo pulled back on a comparatively large lever. Abruptly, the long streaks of Doppler-distorted starlight slowed to hyphen shapes, then finally to familiar bolts of fire. A gauge on the console registered 0. Gigantic chunks of glowing stone appeared out of the nothingness, barely shunted aside by the ship's deflectors. The strain caused the Millennium Falcon to begin shuddering violently. What the? A thoroughly startled Solo muttered. Next to him, Chewbacca offered no comment of his own as he flipped off several controls and activated others. Only the fact that the cautious Solo always emerged from supralight travel with his deflectors up, just in case any of the many unfriendly folks might be waiting for him, had saved the freighter from instant destruction. Luke fought to keep his balance as he made his way into the cockpit. What's going on? We're back in normal space, Solo informed him, but we come out in the middle of the worst asteroid storm I've ever seen. It's not on any of our charts. He peered hard at several indicators. According to the Galactic Atlas, our position is correct. Only one thing is missing. Alderaan. Missing? But that's crazy. I won't argue with you, the Corellian replied grimly, but look for yourself. He gestured out the port. I've triple-checked the coordinates, and there's nothing wrong with the nav computer. We ought to be standing out 1 planetary diameter from the surface. The planet's glow should be filling the cockpit, but there's nothing out there. Nothing but debris. He paused. Judging from the level of wild energy outside and the amount of solid waste, I'd guess that Alderaan's been blown away. Totally. Destroyed, Luke whispered, overwhelmed at the specter raised by such an unimaginable disaster. But how? The Empire, a voice declared firmly. Ben Kenobi had come in behind Luke, and his attention was held by the emptiness ahead, as well as the import behind it. No. Solo was shaking his head slowly. In his own way, even he was stunned by the enormity of what the old man was suggesting. That a human agency had been responsible for the annihilation of an entire population, of a planet itself. No, the entire Imperial fleet couldn't have done this. It would take 1,000 ships massing a lot more firepower than has ever existed. I wonder if we should get out of here, Luke was murmuring, trying to see around the rims of the port. If by some chance it was the Empire. I don't know what's happened here, an angry Solo cursed, but I'll tell you one thing, the Empire isn't. Muffled alarms began humming loudly as a synchronous light flashed on the control console. Solo bent to the appropriate instrumentation. Another ship, he announced. Can't judge the type yet. A survivor, maybe. Someone who might know what happened, Luke ventured hopefully. Ben Kenobi's next words shattered more than that hope. That's an Imperial fighter. Chewbacca suddenly gave an angry bark. A huge flower of destruction blossomed outside the port, battering the freighter violently. A tiny double-winged ball raced past the cockpit port. It followed us, Luke shouted. From Tatooine? It couldn't have, objected a disbelieving Solo. Not in hyperspace. Kenobi was studying the configuration the tracking screen displayed. You're quite right, Han. It's the short-range TIE fighter. Where did that come from? The Corellian wanted to know. There are no Imperial bases near here. It couldn't have been a TIE job. You saw it pass. I know. It looked like a TIE fighter, but what about a base? It's leaving in a big hurry, Luke noted, studying the tracker. No matter where it's going, if it identifies us, we're in big trouble. Not if I can help it, Solo declared. Chewie, jam its transmission. Lay in a pursuit course. It would be best to let it go, Kenobi ventured thoughtfully. It's already too far out of range. Not for long. Several minutes followed, during which the cockpit was filled with a tense silence. All eyes were on the tracking screen and viewport. At first, the Imperial fighter tried a complex evasive course, to no avail. The surprisingly maneuverable freighter hung tight on its tail, continuing to make up the distance between them. Seeing that he couldn't shake his pursuers, the fighter pilot had obviously opened up his tiny engine all the way. Ahead, one of the multitude of stars was becoming steadily brighter. Luke frowned. They were moving fast, but not nearly fast enough for any heavenly object to brighten so rapidly. Something here didn't make sense. Impossible for a fighter that small to be this deep in space on its own, Solo observed. It must have gotten lost, been part of a convoy or something, Luke hypothesized. Solo's comment was gleeful. Well, he won't be around long enough to tell anyone about us. We'll be on top of him in a minute or two. The star ahead continued to brighten, its glow evidently coming from within. It assumed a circular outline. He's heading for that small moon, Luke murmured. The Empire must have an outpost there, Solo admitted, although according to the Atlas, Alderaan had no moons. He shrugged it off. Galactic topography was never one of my best subjects. I'm only interested in worlds and moons with customers on them. But I think I can get him before he gets there. Someone's in range. They drew steadily nearer. Gradually, craters and mountains on the moon became visible. Yet there was something extremely odd about them. The craters were far too regular in outline, the mountains far too vertical, canyons and valleys impossibly straight and regularized. Nothing as capricious as volcanic action had formed those features. That's no moon, Kenobi breathed softly. That's a space station. But it's too big to be a space station, Solo objected. The size of it. It can't be artificial. It can't. I have a very strange feeling about this, was Luke's comment. Abruptly, the usually calm Kenobi was shouting, Turn the ship around. Let's get out of here. Yes, I think you're right, old man. Full reverse, Chewie. The Wookiee started adjusting controls, and the freighter seemed to slow, arcing around in a broad curve. The tiny fighter leaped instantly toward the monstrous station until it was swallowed up by its overpowering bulk. Chewbacca chattered something at Solo as the ship shook and strained against unseen forces. Lock and auxiliary power, Solo ordered. Gauges began to whine in protest, and by ones and twos every instrument on the control console sequentially went berserk. Try as he might, Solo couldn't keep the surface of the gargantuan station from looming steadily larger, until it became the heavens. Luke stared wildly at secondary installations as big as mountains, dish antenna larger than all of Mos Eisley. Why are we still moving toward it? Too late, Kenobi whispered softly. A glance at Solo confirmed his concern. We're caught in a tractor beam, strongest one I ever saw. It's dragging us in, the pilot muttered. You mean there's nothing you can do? Luke asked, feeling unbelievably helpless. Solo studied the overloaded sensor readouts and shook his head. Not against this kind of power. I'm on full power myself, kid, and it's not shifting out of course, a fraction of a degree. It's no use. I'm gonna have to shut down or we'll melt our engines. But they're not going to suck me up like so much dust without a fight. He started to vacate the pilot's chair, but was restrained by an aged yet powerful hand on his shoulder. An expression of concern was on the old man's face, and yet a suggestion of something somewhat less funereal. If it's a fight you cannot win, well, my boy, there are always alternatives to fighting. The true size of the battle station became apparent as the freighter was pulled closer and closer. Running around the station's equator was an artificial cluster of metal mountains, docking ports stretching beckoning fingers nearly 2 kilometers above the surface. Now only a minuscule speck against the gray bulk of the station, the Millennium Falcon was sucked toward one of those steel pseudopods and finally swallowed by it. A lake of metal closed off the entryway, and the freighter vanished as if it had never existed. Vader stared at the motley array of stars displayed on the conference room map while Tarkin and Admiral Motti conferred nearby. Interestingly, the first use of the most powerful destructive machine ever constructed had seemingly had no influence at all on that map, which in itself represented only a tiny fraction of the section of one modest-sized galaxy. It would take a micro-breakdown of a portion of this map to reveal a slight reduction in spatial mass, caused by the disappearance of Alderaan. Alderaan, with its many cities, farms, factories, and towns. And traitors, Vader reminded himself. Despite his advances in intricate technological methods of annihilation, the actions of mankind remained unnoticeable to an uncaring, unimaginably vast universe. If Vader's grandest plans ever came to pass, all that would change. He was well aware that despite all their intelligence and drive, the vastness and wonder were lost on the 2 men who continued to chatter monkey-like behind him. Tarkin and Motti were talented and ambitious, but they saw things only on the scale of human pettiness. It was a pity, Vader thought, that they did not possess the scope to match their abilities. Still, neither man was a Dark Lord. As such, little more could be expected of them. These 2 were useful now, and dangerous, but someday they, like Alderaan, would have to be swept aside. For now he could not afford to ignore them, and while he would have preferred a company of equals, he had to admit reluctantly that at this point he had no equals. Nonetheless, he turned to them and insinuated himself into their conversation. The defense systems on Alderaan, despite the Senator's protestations to the contrary, were as strong as any in the Empire. I should conclude that our demonstration was as impressive as it was thorough. Tarkin turned to him, nodding. The Senate is being informed of our action at this very moment. Soon we will be able to announce the extermination of the Alliance itself, as soon as we have dealt with their main military base. Now that their main source of munitions, Alderaan, has been eliminated, the rest of those systems with secessionist inclinations will fall in line quickly enough, you'll see. Tarkin turned as an Imperial officer entered the chamber. Yes, what is it, Cass? The unlucky officer wore the expression of the mouse chosen to bell the cat. Governor, the advance scouts have reached and circumnavigated Dantooine. They have found the remains of a rebel base, which they estimate has been deserted for some time. Years, possibly. They are proceeding with an extensive survey of the remainder of the system. Tarkin turned apoplectic, his face darkening to a fine pomegranate fury. She lied. She lied to us. No one could see, but it seemed that Vader must have smiled behind his mask. Then we are even in the first exchange of truths. I told you she would never betray the rebellion, unless she thought her confession could somehow destroy us in the process. Terminate her immediately. The governor was barely able to form words. Calm yourself, Tarkin, Vader advised him. You would throw away our only link to the real rebel base so casually? She can still be of value to us. Pfah! You said it yourself, Vader. We'll get nothing more out of her. I'll find that hidden fortress if I have to destroy every star system in this sector. A quiet yet demanding beep interrupted him. Yes, what is it? He inquired irritably. A voice reported over an unseen speaker. Sirs, we've captured a small freighter that was entering the remains of Alderaan. A standard check indicates that its markings apparently match that of the ship, which blasted its way out of the quarantine at Mos Eisley Tatooine system and went hyper before the Imperial blockade craft there could close on it. Tarkin looked puzzled. Mos Eisley? Tatooine? What is this? What's this all about, Vader? It means, Tarkin, that the last of our unresolved difficulties is about to be eliminated. Someone apparently received the missing data tapes, learned who transcribed them, and was trying to return them to her. We may be able to facilitate their meeting with the Senator. Tarkin started to say something, hesitated, then nodded in understanding. How convenient. I leave this matter in your hands, Vader. The Dark Lord bowed slightly, a gesture which Tarkin acknowledged with a perfunctory salute. Then he spun and strode from the room, leaving Madi looking from man to man in confusion. The freighter sat listlessly in the docking hangar of the huge bay. 30 armed Imperial troopers stood before the lowered main ramp leading into the ship. They snapped to attention when Vader and a commander approached. Vader halted at the base of the ramp, studying the vessel as an officer and several soldiers came forward. There was no reply to our repeated signals, sir, so we activated the ramp from outside. We've made no contact with anyone aboard, either by communicator or in person, the officer reported. Send your men in, Vader ordered. Turning, the officer relayed the command to a non-com, who barked orders. A number of the heavily armed soldiers made their way up the ramp and entered the outer hold. They advanced with appreciable caution. Inside, 2 men covered a third as he advanced. Moving in groups of 3 in this fashion, they rapidly spread through the ship. Corridors rang howlily under metal-shod feet, and doors slid aside willingly as they were activated. Empty, the sergeant in charge finally declared in surprise. Check the cockpit. Several troopers made their way forward and slid the portal aside, only to discover the pilot's chairs as vacant as the rest of the freighter. The controls were deactivated and all systems shut down. Only a single light on the console winked on and off fitfully. The sergeant moved forward, recognized the source of the light, and activated the appropriate controls. A printout appeared on a nearby screen. He studied it intently, then turned to convey the information to his superior, who was waiting by the main hatch. That worthy listened carefully before he turned and called down to the commander and Vader. There is no one aboard. The ship is completely deserted, sirs. According to the ship's log, her crew abandoned ship immediately after liftoff, then set her on automatics from Alderaan. Possibly a decoy, the commander ventured aloud. Then they should still be on Tatooine. Possibly, Vader admitted reluctantly. Several of the escape pods have been jettisoned, the officer went on. Did you find any droids on board? Vader called. No, sir, nothing. If there were any, they must have abandoned the ship along with the organic crew. Vader hesitated before replying. When he did so, uncertainty was evident in his voice. This doesn't feel right. Send a fully equipped scanning team on board. I want every centimeter of that ship checked out. See to it as soon as possible. With that, he whirled and stalked from the hangar, pursued by the infuriating feeling that he was overlooking something of vital importance. The rest of the assembled soldiers were dismissed by the officer. On board the freighter, a last lone figure left off examining the space beneath the cockpit consoles and ran to join his comrades. He was anxious to be off this ghost ship and back in the comfortable surroundings of the barracks. His heavy footsteps echoed through the once more empty freighter. Below, the muffled sounds of the officer giving final orders faded, leaving the interior in complete quiet. The quivering of a portion of the floor was the only movement on board. Abruptly, the quivering became a sharp upheaval. Two metal panels popped upward, followed by a pair of tousled heads. Han Solo and Luke looked around quickly, then managed to relax a little when it became clear that the ship was as empty as it sounded. Lucky you'd built these compartments, Luke commented. Solo was not as cheerily confident. Where'd you think I kept smuggled goods? In the main hold? I admit I never expected to smuggle myself in them. He started violently at a sudden sound, but it was only another of the panels shifting aside. This is ridiculous. It isn't going to work. Even if I could take off and get past the closed hatch, he jabbed a thumb upward, we'd never get past that tractor beam. Another panel opened, revealing the face of an elderly imp. You leave that to me. I was afraid you'd say something like that, muttered Solo. You're a damn fool, old man. Kenobi grinned at him. What does that say of the man who allows himself to be hired by a fool? Solo muttered something under his breath as they pulled themselves clear of the compartments, Chewbacca doing so with a good deal of grunting and twisting. Two technicians had arrived at the base of the ramp. They reported to the two bored soldiers guarding it. The ship's all yours, one of the troopers told them. If the scanners pick up anything, report it immediately. The men nodded, then strained to lug their heavy equipment up the ramp. As soon as they disappeared inside, a loud crash was heard. Both guards whirled, then heard a voice call, Hey down there, could you give us a hand with this? One trooper looked at his companion, who shrugged. They both started up the ramp, muttering at the inefficiency of mere technicians. A second crashing sound reverberated, but now there was no one left to hear it. But the absence of the two troopers was noticed soon thereafter. A gantry officer passing the window of a small command office near the freighter entrance glanced out, frowning when he saw no sign of the guards. Concerned, but not alarmed, he moved to the comlink and spoke into it as he continued to stare at the ship. THX 1138, why aren't you at your post? THX 1138, do you copy? The speaker gave back only static. THX 1138, why don't you reply? The officer was beginning to panic when an armored figure descended the ramp and waved toward him. Pointing to the portion of his helmet covering his right ear, the figure tapped it to indicate the comlink inside wasn't working. Shaking his head in disgust, the gantry officer gave his busy aide an annoyed look as he made for the door. Take over here. We got another bad transmitter. I'm going to see what I can do. He activated the door, took a step forward as he slid aside, and stumbled backward in a state of shock. Filling the door completely was a towering, hairy form. Chewbacca leaned inward and with a bone-splintering howl flattened the benumbed officer with one swipe of a pan-sized fist. The aide was already on his feet and reaching for his sidearm when a narrow energy beam passed completely through him, piercing his heart. Solo flipped up the faceplate of his trooper helmet, then slid it back into place as he followed the Wookiee into the room. Kenobi and the droid squeezed in behind him, with Luke, also clad in the armor of a luckless Imperial soldier, bringing up the rear. Luke was looking around nervously as he shut the door behind him. Between his howling and your blasting everything in sight, it's a wonder the entire station doesn't know we're here. Bring 'em on, Solo demanded, unreasonably enthused by their success so far. I prefer a straight fight to all this sneaking around. Maybe you're in a hurry to die, Luke snapped, but I'm not. All this sneaking around has kept us alive. The Corellian gave Luke a sour eye but said nothing. They watched as Kenobi operated an incredibly complex computer console with the ease and confidence of one long accustomed to handling intricate machinery. A screen lit up promptly with a map of sections of the battle station. The old man leaned forward, scrutinizing the display carefully. Meanwhile, 3PO and R2 had been going over an equally complicated control panel nearby. R2 suddenly froze and began whistling wildly at something he had found. Solo and Luke, their momentary disagreement over tactics forgotten, rushed over to where the robots were standing. Chewbacca busied himself hanging in the gantry officer up by his toes. "Plug him in," Kenobi suggested, looking over from his place before the larger readout. "He should be able to draw information from the entire station network. Let's see if we can find out where the tractor beam power is located." "Why not just disconnect the beam from here, sir?" Luke wanted to know. It was Solo who replied derisively. "What, and have them lock it right back on us before we can get the ship's length outside the docking bay?" Luke looked crestfallen. "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." "We have to break the tractor at its power source in order to execute a clean escape, Luke," old Ben chided gently, as R2 punched a claw arm into the open computer socket he'd discovered. Immediately, a galaxy of lights came to life on the panel in front of him, and the room was filled with the hum of machinery working at high speed. Several minutes passed while the little droid sucked up information like a metal sponge. Then the hum slowed and he turned to beep something back at them. "He's found it, sir," 3PO announced excitedly. "The tractor beam is coupled to the main reactors at 7 locations. Most of the pertinent data is restricted, but he'll try to pull the critical information through to the monitor." Kenobi turned his attention from the larger screen to a small readout near R2. Data began to race across it too fast for Luke to see, but apparently Kenobi somehow made something of the schematic blur. "I don't think there's any way you boys can help with this," he told them. "I must go alone." "That suits me fine," said Solo readily. "I've already done more than I bargained for on this trip, but I think putting that tractor beam out of commission is going to take more than your magic, old man." Luke wasn't put off so easily. "I want to go with you." "Don't be impatient, young Luke. This requires skills you haven't yet mastered. Stay and watch over the droids and wait for my signal. They must be delivered to the rebel forces, or many more worlds will meet the same fate as Alderaan. Trust in the Force, Luke, and wait." With a last look at the flow of information on the monitor, Kenobi adjusted the lightsaber at his waist. Stepping to the door, he slid it aside, looked once left, once right, and disappeared down a long, glowing hallway. As soon as he was gone, Chewbacca growled and Solo nodded agreement. "You said it, Chewie." He turned to Luke. "Where'd you dig up that old fossil?" "Ben Kenobi, General Kenobi, is a great man," Luke protested loftily. "Great at getting us into trouble," Solo snorted. "General my afterburners. He's not going to get us out of here." "You have any better ideas?" Luke shot back challengingly. "Anything would be better than us just waiting here for them to come and pick us up. If we—" A hysterical whistling and hooting came from the computer console. Luke hurried over to R2-D2. The little droid was all but hopping about on stubby legs. "What now?" Luke asked 3PO. The taller robot looked puzzled himself. "I'm afraid I don't understand either, sir. He says, 'I found her,' and keeps repeating, 'She's here, she's here.'" "Who? Who has he found?" R2 turned a flat, blinking face toward Luke and whistled frantically. "Princess Leia," 3PO announced after listening carefully. "Senator Organa. They seem to be one and the same. I believe she may be the person in the message she was carrying." That three-dimensional portrait of indescribable beauty coalesced in Luke's mind again. The princess? She's here? Attracted by the commotion, Solo wandered over. "Princess? What's going on?" "Where? Where is she?" Luke demanded breathlessly, ignoring Solo completely. R2 whistled on while 3PO translated. "Level 5, detention block AA-23. According to the information, she's scheduled for slow termination." "No! We've got to do something." "What are you three blabbering about?" an exasperated Solo demanded. "She's the one who programmed the message into R2-D2, Luke explained hurriedly. "The one we were trying to deliver to Alderaan. We've got to help her." "Now just a minute," Solo cautioned him. "This is going awfully fast for me. Don't get any funny ideas. When I said I didn't have any better ideas, I meant it. The old man said to wait here. I don't like it, but I'm not going off on some crazy maze through this place." "But Ben didn't know she was here," Luke half pleaded, half argued. "I'm sure that if he knew, he would have changed his plans." Anxiety turned to thoughtfulness. "Now if we could just figure a way to get into that detention block." Solo shook his head and snapped back. I'm not going into any Imperial detention blocks. "If we don't do something, they're going to execute her." A minute ago you said you didn't want to just sit here and wait to be captured. Now all you want to do is stay. What is it, Han?" The Corellian looked troubled and confused. "Marching into a detention area is not what I had in mind. We're likely to end up there anyway. Why rush it?" "But they're going to execute her." "Better her than me." "Where's your sense of chivalry, Han?" Solo considered. "Near as I can recall, I traded it for a 10-carat cryospaz and 3 bottles of good brandy about 5 years ago on Cominor." "I've seen her," Luke persisted desperately. "She's beautiful." "So's life." "She's a rich and powerful senator," Luke pressed, hoping to appeal to Solo's baser instincts might be more effective. "If we save her, the reward could be substantial." Rich?" Then Solo looked disdainful. "Wait a minute. Reward from whom? From the governor on Alderaan?" He made a sweeping gesture toward the hangar and by implication the space where Alderaan had once orbited. Luke thought furiously. If she's being held here and is scheduled to be executed, that means she must be dangerous in some way to whoever destroyed Alderaan, to whoever had this station built. You can bet it had something to do with the Empire instituting a reign of full repression. "I'll tell you who will pay for her rescue and for the information she holds. The Senate, the Rebel Alliance, and every concern that did business with Alderaan. She could be the sole surviving heir of the off-world wealth of the entire system. The reward could be more wealth than you can imagine." "I don't know. I can imagine quite a bit." He glanced at Chewbacca, who grunted a terse reply. Solo shrugged back at the big Wookiee. "All right, we'll give it a try. But you better be right about that reward. What's your plan, kid?" Luke was momentarily taken aback. All his energies up till now had been concentrated on persuading Solo and Chewbacca to aid in a rescue attempt. That accomplished, Luke became aware he had no idea how to proceed. He had grown used to old Ben and Solo giving directions. Now the next move was up to him. His eyes were caught by several metal circlets dangling from the belt to Solo's armor. "Give me those binders and tell Chewbacca to come over here." Solo handed Luke the thin but quite unbreakable cuffs and relayed the request to Chewbacca. The Wookiee lumbered over and stood waiting next to Luke. "Now I'm going to put these on you," Luke began, starting to move behind the Wookiee with the cuffs, and Chewbacca made a sound low in his throat, and Luke jumped in spite of himself. "Now," he began again, "Han is going to put these on you, and—" He sheepishly handed the binders to Solo, uncomfortably aware of the enormous anthropoid's glowing eyes on him. Solo sounded amused as he moved forward. "Don't worry, Chewie. I think I know what he has in mind." The cuffs barely fit around the thick wrists. Despite his partner's seeming confidence in the plan, the Wookiee wore a worried, frightened look as the restraints were activated. "Luke, sir." Luke looked over at 3PO. "Pardon me for asking, but, what should R2 and I do if someone discovers us here in your absence?" "Hope they don't have blasters," Solo replied. 3PO's tone indicated he didn't find the answer humorous. "That isn't very reassuring." Solo and Luke were too engrossed in their coming expedition to pay much attention to the worried robot. They adjusted their helmets. Then, with Chewbacca wearing a half-real, downcast expression, they started off along the corridor where Ben Kenobi had disappeared. 9. As they traveled farther and deeper into the bowels of the gigantic station, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain an air of casual indifference. Fortunately, those who might have sensed some nervousness on the part of the 2 armored troopers would regard it as only natural, considering their huge, dangerous Wookiee captive. Chewbacca also made it impossible for the 2 young men to be as inconspicuous as they would have liked. The farther they traveled, the heavier the traffic became. Other soldiers, bureaucrats, technicians, and mechanicals bustled around them. Intent on their own assignments, they ignored the trio completely, only a few of the humans sparing the Wookiee a curious glance. Chewbacca's morose expression and the seeming confidence of his captors reassured the inquisitive. Eventually, they reached a wide bank of elevators. Luke breathed a sigh of relief. The computer-controlled transport ought to be capable of taking them just about anywhere on the station in response to a verbal command. There was a nervous second when a minor official raced to get aboard. Solo gestured sharply, and the other, without voicing a protest, shifted to the next elevator tube in line. Luke studied the operating panel, then tried to sound at once knowledgeable and important as he spoke into the pickup grid. Instead, he sounded nervous and scared, but the elevator was a pure response mechanism, not programmed to differentiate the appropriateness of emotions conveyed vocally. So the doors slid shut and they were on their way. After what felt like hours, but what was in reality only minutes, the door opened and they stepped out into the security area. It had been Luke's hope they would discover something like the old-fashioned barred cells of the kind used on Tatooine in towns like Mos Eisley. Instead, they saw only narrow ramps bordering a bottomless ventilation shaft. These walkways, several levels of them, ran parallel to smooth, curving walls, which held faceless detention cells. Alert-looking guards and energy gates seemed to be everywhere they looked. Uncomfortably aware that the longer they stood frozen in place, the sooner someone was bound to come over and ask unanswerable questions, Luke searched frantically for the course of action. "This isn't going to work," Solo whispered, leaning toward him. "Why didn't you say so before?" a frustrated, frightened Luke shot back. "I think I did. Shh!" Solo shut up as Luke's worst fears were realized. A tall, grim-looking officer approached them. He frowned as he examined the silent Chewbacca. "Where are you two going with this thing?" Chewbacca snarled at the remark, and Solo quieted him with a hasty jab in the ribs. A panicky Luke found himself replying almost instinctively. "Prisoner transfer from Block TS-138. The officer looked puzzled. "I wasn't notified. I'll have to clear it." Turning, the man walked to a small console nearby and began entering his request. Luke and Han hurriedly surveyed the situation, their gaze traveling from alarms, energy gates, and remote photosensors to the 3 other guards stationed in the area. Solo nodded to Luke as he unfastened Chewbacca's cuffs, then he whispered something to the Wookiee. An ear-splitting howl shook the corridor as Chewbacca threw up both hands, grabbing Solo's rifle from him. "Look out!" a seemingly terrified Solo shouted. "It's loose! It'll rip us all apart!" Both he and Luke had darted clear of the rampaging Wookiee, pulled out their pistols, and were blasting away at him. Their reaction was excellent, their enthusiasm undeniable, and their aim terrible. Not a single shot came close to the dodging Wookiee. Instead, they blasted automatic cameras, energy rate controls, and the 3 dumbfounded guards. At this point, it occurred to the officer in charge that the abominable aim of the 2 soldiers was a bit too selectively efficient. He was preparing to jab at the general alarm when a burst from Luke's pistol caught him in the midsection, and he fell without a word to the gray deck. Solo rushed to the open comlink speaker, which was screeching anxious questions about what was going on. Apparently there were audio as well as visual links between this detention station and elsewhere. Ignoring the barrage of alternate threats and queries, he checked the readout set in the panel nearby. "We've got to find out which cell this princess of yours is in. There must be a dozen levels in. Here it is. Cell 2187. Go on. Chewie and I'll hold them here." Luke nodded once and was racing down the narrow walkway. After gesturing for the Wookiee to take up a position where he could cover the elevators, Solo took a deep breath and responded to the unceasing calls from the comlink. "Everything's under control," he said into the pickup, sounding reasonably official. "Situation normal." "It didn't sound like that," a voice snapped back in a no-nonsense tone. "What happened?" "Oh, well, one of the guards experienced a weapon malfunction," Solo stammered, his temporary officialness lapsing into nervousness. "No problem now. We're all fine. Thanks. How about you?" "We're sending a squad up," the voice announced suddenly. Han could almost smell the suspicion at the other end. What to say? He spoke more eloquently with the business end of a pistol. Negative. Negative. We have an energy leak. Give us a few minutes to lock it down. Large leak. Very dangerous. Weapon malfunction. Energy leak. Who is this? What's your operating?" Pointing his pistol at the panel, Solo blew the instrument to silent scraps. "It was a dumb conversation anyway," he murmured. Turning, he shouted down the corridor. "Hurry it up, Luke. We're going to have company." Luke heard, but he was absorbed in running from one cell to the next and studying the numbers glowing above each doorway. The cell 2187, it appeared, did not exist. But it did, and he found it just as he was about to give up and try the next level down. For a long moment he examined the featureless convex metal wall. Turning his pistol to maximum and hoping it wouldn't melt in his hand before it broke through, he opened fire on the door. When the weapon became too hot to hold, he tossed it from hand to hand. As he did so, the smoke had time to clear, and he saw with some surprise that the door had been blown away. Peering through the smoke with an uncomprehending look on her face was the young woman whose portrait R2-D2 had projected in a garage on Tatooine several centuries ago. Or so it seemed. She was even more beautiful than her image, Luke decided, staring dazedly at her. "You're even more beautiful than I—" Her look of confusion and uncertainty was replaced by first puzzlement and then impatient. Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper? She finally commented. What? Oh, the uniform. He removed the helmet, regaining a little composure at the same time. I've come to rescue you. I'm Luke Skywalker. I beg your pardon? She said politely. I said I've come to rescue you. Ben Kenobi's with me. We got your 2 droids. The uncertainty was instantly replaced by hope at the mention of the oldster's name. Ben Kenobi? She looked around Luke, ignoring him as she searched for the Jedi. Where is he? Obi-Wan! Governor Tarkin watched as Darth Vader paced rapidly back and forth in the otherwise empty conference room. Finally, the Dark Lord paused, glancing around as though a great bell, only he could hear, had rung somewhere close by. He is here, Vader stated unemotionally. Tarkin looked startled. Obi-Wan Kenobi? That's impossible. What makes you think so? A stirring in the Force, of a kind I've only felt in the presence of my old master. It is unmistakable. Surely he must be dead by now. Vader hesitated, his assurance suddenly gone. Perhaps. It is gone now. It was only a brief sensation. The Jedi are extinct, declared Tarkin positively. Their fire was quenched decades ago. You, my friend, are all that's left of their ways. A comlink buzzed softly for attention. Yes, Tarkin acknowledged. We have an emergency alert in detention block AA-23. The princess! Tarkin yelped, jumping to his feet. Vader whirled, trying to stare through the walls. I knew it. Obi-Wan is here. I knew I could not mistake a stirring in the Force of such power. Put all sections on alert, Tarkin ordered through the comlink. Then he turned to stare at Vader. If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape. Escape may not be Obi-Wan Kenobi's intention, Vader replied, struggling to control his emotions. He is the last of the Jedi, and the greatest. The danger he presents to us must not be underestimated, yet only I can deal with him. His head snapped around to stare fixedly at Tarkin. Alone. Luke and Leia had started back up the corridor when a series of blinding explosions ripped the walkway ahead of them. Several troopers had tried coming through the elevator, only to be crisped one after another by Chewbacca. Disdaining the elevators, they had blasted a gaping hole through a wall. The opening was too large for Solo and the Wookiee to cover completely. In 2s and 3s, the Imperials were working their way into the detention block. Retreating down the walkway, Han and Chewbacca encountered Luke and the princess. We can't go back that way, Solo told them, his face flushed with excitement and worry. No, it looks like you've managed to cut off our only escape route, Leia agreed readily. This is a detention area, you know. They don't build them with multiple exits. Breathing heavily, Solo turned to look her up and down. Begging your forgiveness, Your Highness, he said sarcastically, but maybe you'd prefer it back in your cell? She looked away, her face impassive. There's got to be another way out, Luke muttered, pulling a small transmitter unit from his belt and carefully adjusting the frequency. C-3PO? C-3PO! A familiar voice responded with gratifying speed. Yes, sir? We've been cut off here. Are there any other ways out of the detention area? Anything at all? Static crackled over the tiny grid as Solo and Chewbacca kept the Imperial troops bottled up at the other end of the walkway. What was that? I didn't copy. Back in the gantry office, R2-D2 beeped and whistled frantically as 3PO adjusted controls, fighting to clear the awkward transmission. I said, all systems have been alerted to your presence, sir. The main entry seems to be the only way in or out of the cell block. He pressed instruments, and the view on the nearby readouts changed steadily. All other information on your section is restricted. Someone began banging on the locked door to the office, evenly at first, and then, when no response was forthcoming from within, more insistently. Oh no, 3PO groaned. The smoke in the cell corridor was now so intense that it was difficult for Solo and Chewbacca to pick their targets. That was fortunate inasmuch as they were now badly outnumbered and the smoke confused the Imperials' fire with equal thoroughness. Every so often one of the soldiers would attempt to move closer, only to stand exposed as he penetrated the smoke. Under the accurate fire of the 2 smugglers, he would rapidly join the accumulating mass of motionless figures on the rampway flooring. Energy bolts continued to ricochet wildly through the block as Luke moved close to Solo. There isn't any other way out, he yelled over the deafening roar of the concentrated fire. Well, they're closing in on us. What do we do now? This is some rescue, an irritated voice complained from behind them. Both men turned to see a thoroughly disgusted princess eyeing them with regal disapproval. When you came in here, didn't you have a plan for getting out? Solo nodded toward Luke. He's the brains, sweetheart. Luke managed an embarrassed grin and shrugged helplessly. He turned to help return fire, but before he could do so, the princess had snatched the pistol from his hand. Hey! Luke stared as she moved along the wall, finally locating a small grate nearby. She pointed the pistol at it and fired. Solo gazed at her in disbelief. What do you think you're doing? It looks like it's up to me to save our skins. Get into that garbage chute, flyboy. While the others looked on in amazement, she jumped feet first into the opening and disappeared. Chewbacca rumbled threateningly, but Solo slowly shook his head. No, Chewie, I don't want you to rip her apart. I'm not sure about her yet. Either I'm beginning to like her, or I'm going to kill her myself. The Wookiee snorted something else, and Solo yelled back at him. Go on in, you furry oaf. I don't care what you smell. This is no time to go dainty on me. Shoving the reluctant Wookiee toward the tiny opening, Solo helped jam the massive bulk through. As soon as he disappeared, the Corellian followed him in. Luke fired off a last series of blasts, more in the hope of creating a covering smoke than hitting anything, slid into the chute and was gone. Not wanting to incur further losses in such a confined space, the pursuing soldiers had momentarily halted to await the arrival of reinforcements and heavier weapons. Besides, they had their quarry trapped, and despite their dedication, none of them were anxious to die needlessly. The chamber Luke tumbled into was dimly lit, not that the light was needed to discern its contents. He smelled the decay long before he was dumped into it. Unadorned except for the concealed illuminants, the garbage room was at least a quarter full of slimy muck, most of which had already achieved a state of decomposition sufficient to wrinkle Luke's nose. Solo was stumbling around the edge of the room, slipping and sinking up to his knees in the uncertain footing in an attempt to locate an exit. All he found was a small, thick hatchway which he grunted and heaved to pry open. The hatch cover refused to budge. The garbage chute was a wonderful idea, he told the princess sardonically, wiping the sweat from his forehead. What an incredible smell you've discovered. Unfortunately, we can't ride out of here on a drifting odor, and there doesn't seem to be any other exit, unless I can get this hatch open. Stepping back, he pulled his pistol and fired at the cover. The bolt promptly went howling around the room as everyone sought cover in the garbage. A last glance and the bolt detonated almost on top of them. Looking less dignified by the moment, Leia was the first to emerge from the pungent cover. Put that thing away, she told Solo grimly, or you're going to get us all killed. Yes, your worship, Solo muttered in snide supplication. He made no move to reholster his weapon as he glanced back up toward the open chute above. It won't take long for them to figure out what happened to us. We had things well under control, until you let us down here. Sure you did, she shot back, brushing refuse from her hair and shoulders. Oh, well, it could be worse. As if in reply, a piercing, horrible moaning filled the room. It seemed to come from somewhere beneath them. Chewbacca let out a terrified yowl of his own and tried to flatten himself against a wall. Luke drew his own pistol and peered hard at various clumps of debris, but saw nothing. What was that? Solo asked. I'm not too sure. Luke suddenly jumped, looking down and behind him. Something just moved past me, I think. Watch out. With shocking suddenness, Luke disappeared straight down into the garbage. It's got Luke, the princess shouted. It took him under. Solo looked around frantically for something to shoot at. As abruptly as he had vanished, Luke reappeared, and so did part of something else. A thick, whitish tentacle was wrapped tight around his throat. Shoot it! Kill it! Luke screamed. Shoot it? I can't even see it, Solo protested. Once again, Luke was sucked under by whatever that gruesome appendage was attached to. Solo stared helplessly around the multicolored surface. There was a distant rumble of heavy machinery, and two opposing walls of the chamber moved inward several centimeters. The rumble ceased, and then it was quiet again. Luke appeared unexpectedly close to Solo, scrabbling his way clear of the suffocating mess and grubbing at the welt on his neck. What happened to it? Leia wondered, eyeing the quiescent garbage warily. Luke looked genuinely puzzled. I don't know. It had me, and then it was free. It just let me go and disappeared. Maybe I didn't smell bad enough for it. I got a very bad feeling about this, Solo murmured. Again, the distant rumble filled the room. Again, the walls began their inward march. Only this time, neither sound nor movement showed any sign of stopping. Don't just stand there gaping at each other, the princess urged them. Try to brace them with something. Even with the thick poles and the old metal beams Chewbacca could handle, They were unable to find anything capable of slowing the wall's advance. It seemed as if the stronger the object was that they had placed against the walls, the easier it was snapped. Luke pulled out his comlink, simultaneously trying to talk and will the walls to retreat. 3PO! Come in, 3PO! A decent pause produced no response, causing Luke to look worriedly at his companions. I don't know why he doesn't answer. He tried again. C-3PO, come in. Do you read? C-3PO. The muted voice continued to call. Come in, C-3PO. It was Luke's voice, and it issued softly in between buzzings from the small hand comlink resting on the deserted computer console. Save for the intermittent pleading, the gantry office was silent. A tremendous explosion drowned out the muffled pleadings. It blew the office door clean across the room, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. Several of them struck the comlink, sending it flying to the floor, and cutting off Luke's voice in mid-transmission. In the wake of the minor cataclysm, 4 armed and ready troopers entered through the blown portal. Initial study indicated the office was deserted, until a dim, frightened voice was heard coming from one of the tall supply cabinets through the back of the room. Help! Help! Let us out! Several of the troopers bent to inspect the immobile bodies of the gantry officer and his aide, while others opened the noisy cabinet. 2 robots, one tall and humanoid, the other purely mechanical and 3-legged, stepped out into the office. The taller one gave the impression of being half unbalanced with fear. They're madmen, I tell you, madmen! He gestured urgently toward the doorway. I think they said something about heading for the prison level. They just left. If you hurry, you might catch them. That way, that way! 2 of the troopers inside joined those waiting in the hallway and hustling off down the corridor. That left 2 guards to watch over the office. They totally ignored the robots as they discussed what might have taken place. All the excitement has overloaded the circuitry in my companion here, 3PO explained carefully. If you don't mind, I'd like to take him down to maintenance. One of the guards looked up indifferently and nodded to the robot. 3PO and R2 hurried out the door without looking back. As they departed, it occurred to the guard that the taller of the 2 droids was of a type he had never seen before. He shrugged. It was not surprising on a station of this size. That was too close, 3PO muttered as he scurried down an empty corridor. Now we'll have to find another information control console and plug you back in, or everything is lost. The garbage chamber grew remorselessly smaller, the smoothly fitting metal walls moving toward one another with solid precision. Larger pieces of refuse performed a concerto of snapping and popping that was rising toward a final shuddering crescendo. Chewbacca whined pitifully as he fought with all his incredible strength and weight to hold back one of the walls, looking like a hirsute Tantalus approaching his final summit. One thing's for sure, Solo noted unhappily. We're all going to be much thinner. This could prove popular for slimming. The only trouble is its permanence. Luke paused for breath, shaking the innocent comlink angrily. What could have happened to 3PO? Try the hatch again, advised Leia. It's our only hope. Solo shielded his eyes and did so. The ineffectual blast echoed mockingly through the narrowing chamber. The service bay was unoccupied, everyone apparently having been drawn away by the commotion elsewhere. After a cautious survey of the room, 3PO beckoned for R2 to follow. Together, they commenced a hurried search of the many service panels. R2 let out a beep, and 3PO rushed to him. He waited impatiently as the smaller unit plugged the receptive arm carefully into the open socket. A super-fast flurry of electronics spewed in undisciplined fashion from the grid of the little droid. 3PO made cautioning motions. Wait a minute, slow down. The sounds dropped to a crawl. That's better. They're where? They what? Oh no, they'll only come out of there as liquid. Less than a meter of life was left to the trapped occupants in the garbage room. Leia and Solo had been forced to turn sideways, had ended up facing each other. For the first time, the haughtiness was gone from the princess's face. Reaching out, she took Solo's hand, clutching it convulsively as she felt the first touch of the closing walls. Luke had fallen and was lying on his side, fighting to keep his head above the rising ooze. He nearly choked on a mouthful of compressed sludge when his comlink began buzzing for attention. 3PO! Are you there, sir? The droid replied. We've had some minor problems you would not believe. Shut up, 3PO! Luke screamed into the unit, and shut down all the refuse units on the detention level or immediately below it. Do you copy? Shut down the refuse! Moments later, 3PO grabbed at his head in pain as a terrific screeching and yelling sounded over the comlink. "No! Shut them all down!" he implored R2. "Hurry! Oh, listen to them! They're dying, R2! I curse this metal body of mine! I was not fast enough! It was my fault! My poor master! All of them! No, no, no!" The screaming and yelling, however, continued far beyond what seemed like a reasonable interval. In fact, they were shouts of relief. The chamber walls had reversed direction automatically with R2's shutdown and were moving apart again. "R2, 3PO," Luke hollered into the comlink. "It's all right. We're all right. Do you read me? We're okay. You did just fine." Brushing distastefully at the clinging slime, he made his way as rapidly as possible toward the hatch cover. Bending, he scraped accumulated detritus away, noting the number thus revealed. "Open the pressure maintenance hatch on Unit 366-117891. "Yes, sir," came 3PO's acknowledgement. They may have been the happiest words Luke had ever heard. 10. Lined with power cables and circuitry conduits that rose from the depths and vanished into the heavens, the service trench appeared to be hundreds of kilometers deep. The narrow catwalk running around one side looked like a starched thread glued on a glowing ocean. It was barely wide enough for one man to traverse. One man edged his way along that treacherous walkway now, his gaze intent on something ahead of him instead of the awesome metal abyss below. The clacking sounds of enormous switching devices resounded like captive leviathans in the vast open space, tireless and never sleeping. Two thick cables joined beneath an overlay panel. It was locked, but after a careful inspection of sides, top and bottom, Ben Kenobi pressed the panel cover in a particular fashion, causing it to spring aside. A blinking computer terminal was revealed beneath. With equal care he performed several adjustments to the terminal. His actions were rewarded when several indicator lights on the board changed from red to blue. Without warning, a secondary door close behind him opened. Hurriedly reclosing the panel cover, the old man slipped deeper into the shadows. A detachment of troopers had appeared in the portal, and the officer in charge moved to within a couple of meters of the motionless, hidden figure. "Secure this area until the alert has been cancelled." As they began to disperse, Kenobi became one with the dark. Chewbacca grunted and wheezed and barely succeeded in forcing his thick torso through the hatchway opening with Luke's and Solo's help. That accomplished, Luke turned to take stock of their surroundings. The hallway they had emerged into showed dust on the floor. It gave the impression of not having been used since the station had been built. Probably it was only a repair access corridor. He had no idea where they were. Something hit the wall behind them with a massive thunk, and Luke yelled for everyone to watch out as a long, gelatinous limb worked its way through the hatch and flailed hopefully about in the open corridor. Solo aimed his pistol at it as Leia tried to slip past the half-paralyzed Chewbacca. "Somebody get this big, hairy walking carpet out of my way!" Suddenly, she noticed what Solo was preparing to do. "No, wait! It'll be heard!" Solo ignored her and fired at the hatchway. The burst of energy was rewarded with a distant roar, as an avalanche of weakened wall and beaming all but buried the creature in the chamber beyond. Magnified by the narrow corridor, the sounds continued to roll and echo for long minutes afterward. Luke shook his head in disgust, realizing that someone like Solo who spoke with the mouth of a gun might not always act sensibly. Until now he had sort of looked up to the Corellian, but the senseless gesture of firing at the hatchway brought them, for the first time in Luke's mind, to the same level. The princess's actions were more surprising than Solo's, however. "Listen," she began, staring up at him. "I don't know where you came from, but I'm grateful." Almost as an afterthought, she glanced back at Luke, adding, "To the both of you." Her attention turned back to Solo. "But from now on, you do as I tell you." Solo gaped at her. This time the smug smile wouldn't come. "Look, your holiness," he was finally able to stammer. "Let's get something straight. I take orders only from one person. Me." "It's a wonder you're still alive," she shot back smoothly. A quick look down the corridor and she had started determinedly off in the other direction. Solo looked at Luke, started to say something, then hesitated and simply shook his head slowly. "No reward is worth this. I don't know if there's enough credits in the universe to pay for putting up with her. Hey, slow down!" Leia had started around a bend in the corridor, and they ran swiftly to catch up with her. The half-dozen troops milling around the entrance to the power trench were more interested in discussing the peculiar disturbance in the detention block than in paying attention to their present boring duty. So engrossed were they in speculation as to the cause of the trouble that they failed to notice the fey wraith behind them. It moved from shadow to shadow like a night-stalking ferret, freezing when one of the troopers seemed to turn slightly in its direction, moving on again as if walking on air. Several minutes later, one of the troopers frowned inside his armor, turning to where he thought he had sensed a movement near the opening to the main passageway. There was nothing but an undefinable something which the ghost-like Kenobi had left behind. Acutely uncomfortable, yet understandably unwilling to confess to hallucinations, the trooper turned back to the more prosaic conversation of his fellows. Someone finally discovered the two unconscious guards tied in the service lockers on board the captured freighter. Both men remained comatose despite all efforts to revive them. Under the direction of several bickering officers, troopers carried their two armorless comrades down the ramp and toward the nearest hospital bay. On the way, they passed two forms hidden by a small open service panel. 3PO and R2 went unnoticed, despite their proximity to the hangar. As soon as the troops had passed, R2 finished removing a socket cover and hurriedly shoved his sensor arm into the opening. Lights commenced a wild flashing on his face, and smoke started issuing from several seams on the small droid before a frantic 3PO could pull the arm free. Immediately the smoke vanished, the undisciplined blinking faded to normalcy. R2 emitted a few wilted beeps, successfully giving the impression of a human who had expected a glass of mild wine, and instead unwittingly downed several gulps of something 180 proof. "Well, next time watch where you stick your sensors," 3PO chastised his companion. "You could have fried your insides." He eyed the socket. "That's a power outlet, stupid, not an information terminal." R2 whistled a mournful apology. Together they hunted for the proper outlet. Luke, Solo, Chewbacca, and the princess reached the end of an empty hallway. It dead-ended before a large window which overlooked a hangar, giving them a sweeping, tantalizing view of the freighter just below. Pulling out his comlink and looking around them with increasing nervousness, Luke spoke into the pickup. "C-3PO, do you copy?" There was a threatening pause, then, "I read you, sir. We had to abandon the region around the office. Are you both safe?" "For the moment, though I'm not sanguine about my old age. We're in the main hangar across from the ship." Luke looked toward the bayed window in surprise. "I can't see you across the bay. We might be right above you. Stand by. We'll join you as soon as we can." He clicked off, smiling suddenly at 3PO's reference to his old age. Sometimes the tall droid was more human than people. "Wonder if the old man was able to knock out the tractor," Solo was muttering as he surveyed the scene below. A dozen or so troopers were moving in and out of the freighter. "Getting back to the ship's going to be like flying through the 5 fire rings of Fornax." Leia Organa turned long enough to glance in surprise from the ship to Solo. "You came here in that wreck? You're braver than I thought." At once praised and insulted, Solo wasn't sure how to react. He settled for giving her a dirty look as they started back down the hallway, Chewbacca bringing up the rear. Rounding a corner, the 3 humans came to an abrupt halt. So did the 20 Imperial troopers marching toward them. Reacting naturally, which is to say without thinking, Solo drew his pistol and charged the platoon, yelling and howling in several languages at the top of his lungs. Startled by the totally unexpected assault and wrongly assuming their attacker knew what he was doing, the troopers started to back away. Several wild shots from the Corellian's pistol initiated complete panic. Ranks and composure shattered, the troopers broke and fled down the passage. Drunk with his own prowess, Solo continued the chase, turning to shout back at Luke, "Get to the ship, I'll take care of these." "Are you out of your mind?" Luke yelled at him. "Where do you think you're going?" But Solo had already rounded a far bend in the corridor and didn't hear. Not that it would have made any difference. Upset at his partner's disappearance, Chewbacca let out a thunderous, of unsettled howl and rushed down the hallway after him. That left Luke and Leia standing alone in the empty corridor. "Maybe I was too hard on your friend," she confessed reluctantly. "He certainly is courageous." "He certainly is an idiot," a furious Luke countered tightly. "I don't know what good it'll do us if he gets himself killed." Muted alarm suddenly sounded from the bay below and behind them. "That's done it," Luke growled disgustedly. "Let's go." Together they started off in search of a way down to a hangar-level deck. Solo continued his route of all opposition, running at top speed down the long hallway, yelling and brandishing his pistol. Occasionally he got off a shot whose effect was more valuable psychologically than tactically. Half the troops had already scattered down various sub-passages and corridors. The 10 troopers he continued to harry still raced headlong away from him, returning his fire only indifferently. Then they came up against a dead end, which forced them to turn and confront their opponents. Seeing that the 10 had halted, Solo likewise slowed. Gradually he came to a complete stop. Corellian and Imperials regarded one another silently. Several of the troopers were staring, not at Han, but past him. It suddenly occurred to Solo that he was very much alone, and the same thought was beginning to seep into the minds of the guards he was confronting. Embarrassment gave way rapidly to anger. Rifles and pistols started to come up. Solo took a step backward, fired one shot, then turned and ran like hell. Chewbacca heard the whistle and crump of energy weapons firing as he lumbered lightly down the corridor. There was something odd about them, though. They sounded as if they were coming closer instead of moving away. He was debating what to do when Solo came tearing around a corner and nearly ran him down. Seeing 10 troopers in pursuit, the Wookiee decided to reserve his questions for a less confused moment. He turned and followed Solo back up the hallway. Luke grabbed the princess and pulled her back into a recess. She was about to retort angrily at his brusqueness when the sound of marching feet caused her to shrink back into the darkness with him. A squad of soldiers hurried past, responding to the alarms that continued to ring steadily. Luke looked out at the retreating backs and tried to catch his breath. Our only hope of reaching the ship is from the other side of the hangar. They already know someone's here. He started back down the corridor, motioning for her to follow. 2 guards appeared at the far end of the passageway, paused, and pointed directly at them. Turning, Luke and Leia began running back the way they had come. A larger squad of troopers rounded the far bend and came racing toward them. Blocked ahead and behind, they hunted frantically for another way out. Then Leia spotted the cramped sub-hallway and gestured to it. Luke fired at the nearest of his pursuers and joined her in running down the narrow passage. It looked like a minor service corridor. Behind them, pursuit sounded deafeningly loud in the confining space, but at least it minimized the amount of fire the troops could concentrate on them. A thick hatchway appeared ahead. The lighting beyond turned dimmer, raising Luke's hopes. If they could lock the hatch even for a few moments and lose themselves somewhere beyond, they might have a chance of shaking their immediate tormentors. But the hatch stayed open, showing no inclination to close automatically. Luke was about to let out a shout of triumph when the ground suddenly vanished ahead of him. His toes hanging over nothingness, he flailed to regain his balance, succeeding just in time to nearly go over the edge of the retracted catwalk anyway, as the princess plowed into him from behind. The catwalk had been reduced to a stub protruding into empty air. A cool draft caressed Luke's face as he studied walls that soared to unseen heights overhead and plunged to fathomless depths below. The service shaft was employed in circulating and recycling the atmosphere of the station. At the moment, Luke was too frightened and concerned to be angry with the princess for nearly sending them over the edge. Besides, other dangers competed for his attention. A burst of energy exploded above their heads, sending metal slivers flying. "I think we made a wrong turn," he murmured, firing back at the advancing troops and illuminating the narrow corridor behind them with destruction. An open hatchway showed on the other side of the chasm. It might as well have been a light year away. Hunting along the rim of the doorway, Leia located a switch and hit it quickly. The hatch door behind them slid shut with a resounding boom. At least that cut off fire from the rapidly nearing soldiers. It also left the 2 fugitives balanced precariously on a small section of catwalk barely a meter square. If the remaining section were to unexpectedly withdraw into the wall, they would see more of the battle station's interior than either wished. Gesturing for the princess to move aside as much as possible, Luke shielded his eyes and aimed the pistol at the hatch controls. A brief burst of energy melted them flush with the wall, ensuring that no one could open it easily from the other side. Then he turned his attention to the vast cavity blocking their path to the opposite portal. It beckoned invitingly, a small yellow rectangle of freedom. Only the soft rush of air from below sounded until Luke commented, "This is a shield-rated door, but it won't hold them back very long." "We've got to get across there somehow," Leia agreed, once more examining the metal bordering the sealed doorway. "Find the controls for extending the bridge." Some desperate searching produced nothing, while an ominous pounding and hissing sounded from behind the frozen door. A small spot of white appeared in the center of the metal, then began to spread in smoke. "They're coming through," Luke groaned. The princess turned carefully to stare across the gap. This must be a single-unit bridge, with the controls only on the other side. Reaching up to point at the panel holding the unreachable controls, Luke's hand caught on something at his waist. A frustrated glance downward revealed the cause, and engendered a bit of practical insanity. The cable coiled tightly in small loops. It was thin and fragile seeming, but it was general military-issue line and would have supported Chewbacca's weight easily. It certainly ought to hold Leia and himself. Pulling the cable free of the waist catch, he gauged its length, matching it against the width of the abyss. This should span the distance with plenty to spare. "What now?" the princess inquired curiously. Luke didn't reply. Instead, he removed a small but heavy power unit from the utility belt of his armor and tied one end of the cable around it. Making sure the wrapping was secure, he stepped as close to the edge of their uncertain perch as he dared. Whirling the weighted end of the cord in increasing circles, he let it arc across the gorge. It struck an outcropping of cylindrical conduits on the other side and fell downward. With forced patience, he pulled the loose line back, then recoiled it for another try. Once again the weighted end orbited in ever greater circles, and again he flung it across the gap. He could feel the rising heat behind him as he let it go, heat from the melting metal doorway. This time the heavy end looped around an outcropping of pipes above, wrapped itself several times around, and slipped, battery end down, into a crack between them. Leaning backward, he tugged and pulled on the cable, pulling on it at the same time as he tried to rest all of his weight on it. The cable showed no sign of parting. Wrapping the other end of the line several times around his waist and right arm, he reached out and pulled the princess close to him with the other. The hatch door behind them was now a molten white, and liquid metal was running steadily from its borders. Something warm and pleasant touched Luke's lips, alerting every nerve in his body. He looked down in shock at the princess, his mouth still tingling from the kiss. "Just for luck," she murmured with a slight, almost embarrassed smile, as she put her arms around him. "We're going to need it." Gripping the thin cable as tightly as possible with his left hand, Luke put his right over it, took a deep breath, and jumped out into air. If he had miscalculated the degree of arc in their swing, they would miss the open hatch and slam into the metal wall to either side or below it. If that happened, he doubted he could maintain his grip on the rope. The heart-halting transit was accomplished in less time than he thought. In a moment, Luke was on the other side, scrambling on his knees to make sure they didn't fall back into the pit. Leia released her hold on him with admirable timing. She rolled forward and into the open hatchway, climbing gracefully to her feet as Luke fought to untangle himself from the cable. A distant whine became a loud hiss, then a groan as the hatch door on the other side gave way. It collapsed inward and tumbled into the depths. If it touched bottom, Luke didn't hear it. A few bolts struck the wall nearby. Luke turned his own weapon on the unsuccessful troopers and returned the fire even as Leia was pulling him into the passage beyond. Once clear of the door, he hit the activating switch. It shut tightly behind them. They would have several minutes at least without having to worry about being shot in the back. On the other hand, Luke didn't have the slightest idea where they were, and he found himself wondering what had happened to Han and Chewbacca. Solo and his Wookiee partner had succeeded in shaking a portion of their pursuers, but it seemed that whenever they slipped free of several soldiers, more appeared to take their place. No question about it, the word was out on them. Ahead, a series of shield doors was beginning to close. "Hurry, Chewie," Solo urged. Chewbacca grunted once, breathing like an overused engine. Despite his immense strength, the Wookiee was not built for long-distance sprinting. Only his enormous stride had enabled him to keep pace with the lithe Corellian. Chewbacca left a couple of hairs in one of the doors, but both slipped inside just before the 5 layers slammed shut. "That ought to hold him for a while," Solo crowed with delight. The Wookiee growled something at him, but his partner fairly fluoresced with confidence. "Of course I can find the ship from here. Corellians can't get lost." There came another growl, slightly accusing this time. Solo shrugged. "Tok'nipul doesn't count. He wasn't a Corellian. Besides, I was drunk." Ben Kenobi ducked into the shadows of a narrow passageway, seeming to become part of the metal itself as a large cluster of troopers hurried past him. Pausing to make certain they had all passed, he checked the corridor ahead before starting down. But he failed to see the dark silhouette which eclipsed the light far behind him. Kenobi had avoided one patrol after another, slowly working his way back toward the docking bay holding the freighter. Just another 2 turns and he should be at the hangar. What he would do then would be determined by how inconspicuous his charges had been. That young Luke, the adventurous Corellian and his partner, and the 2 robots had been involved in something other than quiet napping, he already suspected from the amount of activity he'd observed while making his way back from the power trench. Surely all those troops hadn't been out hunting just for him. But something else was troubling him. Judging from the references he had overheard concerning a certain important prisoner now escaped, that discovery had puzzled him until he considered the restless natures of both Luke and Han Solo. Undoubtedly they were involved in some fashion. Ben sensed something directly ahead and slowed cautiously. It had a most familiar feel to it, a half-remembered mental odor he could not quite place. Then the figure stepped out in front of him, blocking his entry to the hangar not 5 meters away. The outline and size of the figure completed the momentary puzzle. It was the maturity of the mind he had sensed that had temporarily confused him. His hand moved naturally to the hilt of his deactivated saber. "I have been waiting a long time, Obi-Wan Kenobi," Darth Vader intoned solemnly. "We meet again at last. The circle has been completed." Kenobi sensed satisfaction beneath the hideous mask. "The presence I sensed earlier could only have been you." Kenobi regarded the great form blocking his retreat and nodded slowly. He gave the impression of being more curious than impressed. "You still have much to learn." "You were once my teacher," Vader admitted, "and I learned much from you. But the time of learning has long passed, and I am the master now." The logic that had constituted the missing link in his brilliant pupil remained as absent as before. There would be no reasoning here, Kenobi knew. Igniting his saber, he assumed the pose of a warrior ready, a movement accomplished with the ease and elegance of a dancer. Rather roughly, Vader imitated the movement. Several minutes followed without motion as the 2 men remained staring at each other, as if waiting for some proper, as yet unspoken, signal. Kenobi blinked once, shook his head, and tried to clear his eyes, which had begun to water slightly. Sweat beaded up on his forehead, and his eyelids fluttered again. "Your powers are weak," Vader noted emotionlessly. "Old man, you should have never come back. It will make your end less peaceful than you might have wished." "You sense only a part of the Force, Darth," Kenobi murmured with the assurance of one to whom death is merely another sensation, like sleeping or making love or touching a candle. "As always, you perceive its reality as little as a utensil perceives the taste of food." Executing a move of incredible swiftness for one so old, Kenobi lunged at the massive shape. Vader blocked the stab with equal speed, riposting with a counter-slash that Kenobi barely parried. Another parry and Kenobi countered again, using this opportunity to move around the towering Dark Lord. They continued to trade blows, with the old man now backing toward the hangar. Once his saber and Vader's locked, the interaction of the 2 energy fields producing a violent sparking and flashing. A low buzzing sound rose from the straining power units as each saber sought to override the other. 3PO peeked around the entrance to the docking bay, worriedly counting the number of troopers milling around the deserted freighter. Where could they be? Oh. He ducked back out of sight just as one of the guards glanced in his direction. A second, more cautious appraisal was more rewarding. It revealed Han Solo and Chewbacca hugging the wall of another tunnel on the far side of the bay. Solo also was nonplussed at the number of guards. He muttered, "Didn't we just leave this party?" Chewbacca grunted and both turned, only to relax and lower their weapons at the sight of Luke and the princess. "What kept you?" Solo quipped mirthlessly. "We ran into," Leia explained, panting heavily, "some old friends." Luke was staring at the freighter. "Is the ship all right?" "Seems okay," was Solo's analysis. "It doesn't look like they removed anything or disturbed her engines. The problem's going to be getting to it." Leia suddenly pointed to one of the opposite tunnels. "Look!" Illuminated by the flare from contacting energy fields, Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader were backing towards the bay. The fight attracted the attention of others besides the senator. Every one of the guards moved in for a better view of the Olympian conflict. "Now's our chance," Solo observed, starting forward. All 7 of the troopers guarding the ship broke and rushed toward the combatants, going to the Dark Lord's aid. 3PO barely ducked aside as they ran past him. Turning back into the alcove, he yelled to his companion, "Unplug yourself, R2, we're leaving!" As soon as the R2 unit slipped his sensor arm free of the socket, the two droids began to slowly edge out into the open bay. Kenobi heard the approaching commotion and spared a glance back into the hangar. The squad of troopers bearing down on him was enough to show that he was trapped. Vader took immediate advantage of the momentary distraction to bring his saber over and down. Kenobi somehow managed to deflect the sweeping blow, at once parrying and turning a complete circle. "You still have your skill, but your power fades. Prepare to meet the Force, Obi-Wan." Kenobi gauged the shrinking distance between the oncoming troops and himself, then turned a pitying gaze on Vader. "This is a fight you cannot win, Darth. Your power has matured since I taught you, but I too have grown much since our parting. If my blade finds its mark, you will cease to exist. But if you cut me down, I will only become more powerful. Heed my words." "Your philosophies no longer confuse me, old man," Vader growled contemptuously. "I am the master now." Once again he lunged forward, feinting, and then slashing in a deadly downward arc with the saber. It struck home, cutting the old man cleanly in half. There was a brief flash as Kenobi's cloak fluttered to the deck in two neat sections. But Ben Kenobi was not in it. Wary of some tricks, Vader poked at the empty cloak sections with the saber. There was no sign of the old man. He had vanished as though he had never existed. The guards slowed their approach and joined Vader in examining the place where Kenobi had stood seconds before. Several of them muttered, and even the awesome presence of the Sith Lord couldn't keep a few of them from feeling a little afraid. Once the guards had turned and dashed for the far tunnel, Solo and the others started for the starship, until Luke saw Kenobi cut in two. Instantly he shifted direction and was moving toward the guards. "Ben!" he screamed, firing wildly toward the troops. Solo cursed, but turned to fire in support of Luke. One of the energy bolts struck the safety release on the tunnel blast door. The emergency hold broken. The heavy door fairly exploded downward. But the guards and Vader leaped clear, the guards into the bay and Vader backward, to the opposite side of the door. Solo had turned and started for the entrance to the ship, but he paused as he saw Luke running toward the guards. "It's too late," Leia yelled at him. "It's over." "No!" Luke half shouted, half sobbed. A familiar yet different voice rang in his ears. Ben's voice. "Luke, listen," was all it said. Bewildered, Luke turned to hunt for the source of that admonition. He only saw Leia beckoning to him as she followed R2 and 3PO up the ramp. "Come on, there's no time." Hesitating, his mind still on that imagined voice. Or was it imagined? A confused Luke took aim and felled several soldiers before he, too, whirled and retreated into the freighter. 11. Dazed, Luke staggered toward the front of the ship. He barely noticed the sound of energy bolts, too weak to penetrate the ship's deflectors, exploding harmlessly outside. His own safety was currently of little concern to him. With misty eyes he stared as Chewbacca and Solo adjusted controls. "I hope that old man managed to knock out that tractor beam," the Corellian was saying, "or this is going to be a very short ride." Ignoring him, Luke returned to the hold area and slumped into a seat, his head falling into his hands. Leia Organa regarded him quietly for a while, then removed her cloak. Moving to him, she placed it gently around his shoulders. "There wasn't anything you could have done," she whispered comfortingly. "It was all over in an instant." "I can't believe he's gone," came Luke's reply, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "I can't." Solo shifted a lever, staring nervously ahead, but the massive bay door was constructed to respond to the approach of any vessel. The safety feature now served to facilitate their escape as the freighter slipped quickly past the still opening door and out into free space. "Nothing." Solo sighed, studying several readouts with profound satisfaction. "Not so much as an erg of come hither. He did it all right." Chewbacca rumbled something, and the pilot's attention shifted to another series of gauges. "Right, Chewie. I forgot for a moment that there are other ways of persuading us to return." His teeth flashed in a grin of determination. "But the only way they'll get us back in that traveling tomb is in pieces. Take over." Whirling, he ran out of the cockpit. "Come with me, kid," he shouted at Luke as he entered the hold. "We're not out of this yet." Luke didn't respond, didn't move, and Leia turned an angry face to Solo. "Leave him alone. Can't you see what the old man meant to him?" An explosion jarred the ship, nearly tumbling Solo to the deck. "So what? The old man gave himself to give us a chance to get away. You want to waste that, Luke? You want Kenobi to have wasted himself?" Luke's head came up and he stared with vacant eyes at the Corellian. No, not quite vacant. There was something too old and unpleasant shining blindly in the back of them. Without a word, he threw off the cloak and joined Solo. Giving him a reassuring smile, Solo gestured down a narrow accessway. Luke looked in the indicated direction, smiled grimly, and rushed down it as Solo started down the opposing passageway. Luke found himself in a large rotating bubble protruding from the side of the ship. A long, wicked-looking tube whose purpose was instantly apparent projected from the apex of the transparent hemisphere. Luke settled himself into the seat and commenced a rapid study of the controls. Activator here, firing grip here. He had fired such weapons 1,000 times before. In his dreams. Forward, Chewbacca and Leia were searching the speckled pit outside for the attacking fighters represented by fire pricks on several screens. Chewbacca suddenly growled throatily and pulled back on several controls as Leia let out a yelp. "Here they come!" The starfield wheeled around Luke as an Imperial TIE fighter raced toward him and then swung overhead to vanish into the distance. Within the tiny cockpit, its pilot frowned as the supposedly battered freighters darted out of range. Adjusting his own controls, he swung up and over in a high arc intended to take him on a fresh intercept course with the escaping ship. Solo fired at another fighter, and its pilot nearly slammed his engine through its mountings as he fought to avoid the powerful energy bolts. As he did so, his hurried maneuver brought him under and around to the other side of the freighter. Even as he was lowering the glare reflector over his eyes, Luke opened up on the racing fighter. Chewbacca was alternating his attention between the instruments and the tracking screens, while Leia strained to separate distant stars from nearby assassins. Two fighters dove simultaneously on the twisting, spiraling freighter, trying to line their weapons on the unexpectedly flexible craft. Solo fired at the descending globes, and Luke followed with his own weapon a second later. Both fired on the starship and then shot past. "They're coming in too fast!" Luke yelled into his comlink. Another enemy bolt struck the freighter forward and was barely shunted aside by its deflectors. The cockpit shuddered violently, and gauges whined in protest at the quantity of energy they were being asked to monitor and compensate for. Chewbacca muttered something to Leia, and she murmured a soft reply as if she almost understood. Another fighter unloosed a barrage at the freighter, only this time the bolt pierced an overloaded screen and actually struck the side of the ship. Though partially deflected, it still carried enough power to blow out a large control panel in the main passageway, sending a rain of sparks and smoke in all directions. R2-D2 started stolidly toward the miniature inferno as the ship lurched crazily, throwing the less stable 3PO into a cabinet full of component chips. A warning light began to wink for attention in the cockpit. Chewbacca muttered to Leia, who stared at him worriedly and wished for the gift of Wookiee gab. Then a fighter floated down on the damaged freighter, right into Luke's sights. His mouth moving silently, Luke fired at it. The incredibly agile little vessel darted out of his range, but as it passed beneath them, Solo picked it up instantly and commenced a steady following fire. Without warning, the fighter erupted in an incredible flash of multicolored light, throwing a billion bits of superheated metal to every section of the cosmos. Solo whirled and gave Luke a victory wave, which the younger man gleefully returned. Then they turned back to their weapons as yet another fighter stormed over the freighter's hull, firing at its transmitter dish. In the middle of the main passageway, angry flames raged around a stubby cylindrical shape. A fine white powdery spray issued from R2-D2's head. Wherever it touched, the fire retreated sharply. Luke tried to relax, to become a part of the weapon. Almost without being aware of it, he was firing at a retreating Imperial. When he blinked, it was to see the flaming fragments of the enemy craft forming a perfect ball of light outside the turret. It was his turn to spin and flash the Corellian a grin of triumph. In the cockpit, Leia paid close attention to scattered readouts, as well as searching the sky for additional ships. She directed her voice toward an open mic. "There are still two more of them out there. Looks like we've lost the lateral monitors and the starboard deflector shield." "Don't worry," Solo told her, with as much hope as confidence. She'll hold together. He gave the walls a pleading stare. You hear me, ship? Hold together. Chewie, try to keep them on our port side. If we... He was forced to break off as a TIE fighter seemed to materialize out of nowhere, energy bolts reaching out from it toward him. Its companion craft came up on the freighter's other side, and Luke found himself firing steadily at it, ignoring the immensely powerful energy it threw at him. At the last possible instant before it passed out of range, he swung the weapon's nozzle minutely, his finger tightening convulsively on the fire control. The Imperial fighter turned into a rapidly expanding cloud of phosphorescing dust. The other fighter apparently considered the shrunken odds, turned and retreated at top speed. "We've made it!" Leia shouted, turning to give the startled Wookiee an unexpected hug. He growled at her, very softly. Darth Vader strode into the control room where Governor Tarkin stood staring at a huge, brilliantly lit screen. It displayed a sea of stars, but it was not the spectacular view which absorbed the Governor's thoughts at the moment. He barely glanced around as Vader entered. "Are they away?" the Dark Lord demanded. "They've just completed the jump to hyperspace. No doubt they are at this very moment congratulating themselves on their daring and success." Now Tarkin turned to face Vader, a hint of warning in his tone. "I'm taking an awful chance on your insistence, Vader. This had better work. Are you certain the homing beacon is secure aboard their ship?" Vader exuded confidence beneath the reflective black mask. "There is nothing to fear. This will be a day long remembered. It already has been witness to the final extinction of the Jedi. Soon it will see the end of the Alliance and the Rebellion." Solo switched places with Chewbacca, the Wookiee grateful for the opportunity to relinquish the controls. As the Corellian moved aft to check the extent of the damage, a determined-looking Leia passed him in the corridor. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Solo inquired, well pleased with himself. "Not a bad bit of rescuing. You know, sometimes I amaze even myself." "That doesn't sound too hard," she admitted readily. "The important thing is not my safety, but the fact that the information in the R2 droid is still intact." "What's that droid carrying that's so important anyway?" Leia considered the blazing starfield forward. "Complete technical schematics of the battle station. I only hope that when the data is analyzed, a weakness can be found. Until then, until the station itself is destroyed, we must go on. This war isn't over yet." "It is for me," objected the pilot. "I'm not on this mission for your revolution. Economics interests me, not politics. There's business to be done under any government, and I'm not doing it for you, Princess. I expect to be well paid for risking my ship and my hide." "You needn't worry about your reward," she assured him sadly, turning to leave. "If money is what you love, that's what you will receive." On leaving the cockpit, she saw Luke coming forward, and she spoke softly to him in passing. "Your friend is indeed a mercenary. I wonder if he really cares about anything, or anybody." Luke stared after her until she disappeared into the main hold area, then whispered, "I do. I care." Then he moved into the cockpit and sat in the seat Chewbacca had just vacated. "What do you think of her, Han?" Solo didn't hesitate. "I try not to." Luke probably hadn't intended his response to be audible, but Solo overheard his murmur of good nonetheless. "Still," Solo ventured thoughtfully, "she's got a lot of spirit to go with her sass. I don't know. Do you think it's possible for a princess and a guy like me?" "No!" Luke cut him off sharply. He turned and looked away. Solo smiled at the younger man's jealousy, uncertain in his own mind whether he had added the comment to bait his naive friend, or because it was the truth. Yavin was not a habitable world. The huge gas giant was patterned with pastel high-altitude cloud formations. Here and there, the softly lambent atmosphere was molded by cyclonic clouds, composed of 600-kilometer-per-hour winds, which boiled rolling gases up for the Yavinesque troposphere. It was a world of lingering beauty and quick death for any who might try to penetrate to its comparatively small core of frozen liquids. Several of the gas planets' numerous moons, however, were planet-sized themselves, and of these, 3 could support humanoid life. Particularly inviting was a satellite designated by the system's discoverers as Number 4. It shone like an emerald in Yavin's necklace of moons, rich with plant and animal life, but it was not listed among those worlds supporting human settlement. Yavin was located too far from the settled regions of the galaxy. Perhaps the latter reason, or both, or a combination of causes still unknown, had been responsible for whatever race had once risen from Satellite 4's jungles, only to disappear quietly long before the first human explorer set foot on the tiny world. Little was known of them save that they left a number of impressive monuments, and that they were one of the many races which had aspired to the stars, only to have their desperate reach fall short. Now all that remained were the mounds and foliage-clad clumps, formed by jungle-covered buildings. But though they had sunk back into the dust, their artifacts and their world continued to serve an important purpose. Strange cries and barely perceptible moans sounded from every tree and copse. Hoots and growls and strange mutterings issued from creatures content to remain concealed in the dense undergrowth. Whenever dawn broke over Moon the Fourth, heralding one of its long days, an especially feral chorus of shrieks and weirdly modulated screams would resound through the thick mist. Even stranger sounds surged continually from one particular place. Here lay the most impressive of those edifices which a vanished race had raised toward the heavens. It was a temple, a roughly pyramidal structure so colossal that it seemed impossible it could have been built without the aid of modern gravitonic construction techniques. Yet all evidence pointed only to simple machines, hand technology, and perhaps devices alien and long lost. While the science of this moon's inhabitants had led them to a dead end as far as off-world travel was concerned, they had produced several discoveries which in certain ways surpassed similar imperial accomplishments, one of which involved a still unexplained method of cutting and transporting gargantuan blocks of stone from the crust of the moon. From these monstrous blocks of solid rock, the massive temple had been constructed. The jungle had scaled even its soaring crest, clothing it in rich green and brown. Only near its base and the temple front did the jungle slide away completely, to reveal a long, dark entrance cut by its builders and enlarged to suit the needs of the structure's present occupants. A tiny machine, its smooth metal sides and silvery hue incongruous amidst the all-pervasive green, appeared in the forest. It hummed like a fat, swollen beetle as it conveyed its cluster of passengers toward the open temple base. Crossing a considerable clearing, it was soon swallowed up by the dark maw in the front of the massive structure, leaving the jungle once more in the paws and claws of invisible squallers and screechers. The original builders would never have recognized the interior of their temple. Seamed metal had replaced rock, and poured paneling did service for chamber division in place of wood. Nor would they have been able to see the buried layers excavated into the rock below, layers which contained hangar upon hangar linked by powerful elevators. A land speeder came to a gradual stop within the temple, whose first level was the uppermost of the ship-filled hangars. Its engine died obediently as the vehicle settled to the ground. A noisy cluster of humans waiting nearby ceased their conversation and rushed toward the craft. Fortunately, Leia Organa quickly emerged from the speeder, or the man who reached it first might have pulled her bodily from it, so great was his delight at the sight of her. He settled for giving her a smothering hug as his companion called their own greetings. "You're safe. We'd feared you'd been killed." Abruptly he composed himself, stepped away from her, and executed a formal bow. "When we heard about Alderaan, we were afraid that you were lost along with the rest of the population." "All that is past history, Commander Willard," she said. "We have a future to live for. Alderaan and its people are gone." Her voice turned bitter cold, frightening in so delicate a looking person. "We must see that such does not happen again." "We don't have time for our sorrows, Commander," she continued briskly. "The battle station has surely tracked us here." Solo started to protest, but she shut him up with a logic and stern look. "That's the only explanation for the ease of our escape. They sent only 4 TIE fighters after us. They could have easily launched 100. Solo had no reply for that, but continued to fume silently. Then Leia gestured at R2-D2. "You must use the information locked in this R2 droid to form a plan of attack. It's our only hope. The station itself is more powerful than anyone suspected." Her voice dropped. "If the data does not yield a weakness, there will be no stopping them." Luke was then treated to a sight unique in his experience, unique in most men's. Several rebel technicians walked up to R2-D2, positioned themselves around him, and gently hoisted him in their arms. This was the first, and probably the last time, he would ever see a robot being carried respectfully by men. Theoretically, no weapon could penetrate the exceptionally dense stone of the ancient temple, but Luke had seen the shattered remains of Alderaan and knew that for those in the incredible battle station, the entire moon would present simply another abstract problem in mass energy conversion. Little R2-D2 rested comfortably in a place of honor, his body radiating computer and databank hookups like a metal hairdo. On an array of screens and readouts nearby, the technical information stored on the sub-microscopic record tape within the robot's brain was being played out. Hours of it. Diagrams, charts, statistics. First, the ration material was slowed and digested by more sophisticated computer minds. Then the most critical information was turned over to human analysts for detailed evaluation. All the while, C-3PO stood close to R2, marveling at how so much complex data could be stored in the mind of so simple a droid. The central briefing room was located deep within the bowels of the temple. The long, low-ceilinged auditorium was dominated by a raised dais and huge electronic display screen at its far end. Pilots, navigators, and a sprinkling of R2 units filled the seats. Impatient and feeling very out of place, Han Solo and Chewbacca stood as far away from the stage, with its assemblage of officers and senators, as possible. Solo scanned the crowd, searching for Luke. Despite some common sense entreaties, the crazy kid had gone and joined the regular pilots. He didn't see Luke, but he recognized the princess as she talked soberly with some bemedaled oldster. When a tall, dignified gentleman with too many deaths on his soul moved to stand by the far side of the screen, Solo turned his attention to him, as did everyone else in the room. As soon as an expectant silence had gripped the crowd, General Jan Dodonna adjusted the tiny mic on his chest and indicated the small group seated close to him. "You all know these people," he intoned with quiet power. "They are the senators and generals whose worlds have given us support, whether open or covert. They have come to be with us in what may well prove to be the decisive moment." He let his gaze touch many in the crowd, and none who were so favored remained unmoved. "The Imperial battle station, you now all have heard, is approaching from the far side of Yavin and its sun. That gives us a little extra time, but it must be stopped, once and for all, before it can reach this moon, before it can bring its weaponry to bear on us as it did on Alderaan." A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of that world, so callously obliterated. "The station," Dodonna went on, "is heavily shielded and mounts more firepower than half the Imperial fleet, but its defenses were designed to fend off large-scale capital ship assaults. A small 1 or 2-man fighter should be able to slip through its defensive screens." A slim, supple man who resembled an older version of Han Solo rose. Dodonna acknowledged his presence. "What is it, Red Leader?" The man gestured toward the display screen, which showed a computer portrait of the battle station. "Pardon me for asking, sir, but what good are our snub fighters going to be against that?" Dodonna considered. "Well, the Empire doesn't think a one-man fighter's any threat to anything except another small ship, like a TIE fighter, or they would have provided tighter screens. Apparently they're convinced that their defensive weaponry can fend off any light attacks. But an analysis of the plans provided by Princess Leia has revealed what we think is a weakness in the station's design. A big ship couldn't get near it, but an extra Y-wing fighter might. It's a small thermal exhaust port. Its size belies its importance, as it appears to be an unshielded shaft that runs directly into the main reactor system powering the station. Since this serves as an emergency outlet for waste heat in the event of reactor overproduction, its usefulness would be eliminated by particle shielding. A direct hit would initiate a chain reaction that will destroy the station." Mutterings of disbelief ran through the room. The more experienced the pilot, the greater his expressed disbelief. "I didn't say your approach would be easy," Dodonna admonished them. He gestured at the screen. "You must maneuver straight in down this shaft, level off in the trench, and skim the surface to this point. The target is only 2 meters across. It will take a precise hit at exactly 90 degrees to reach the reactor systemization, and only a direct hit will start the complete reaction." I said the port wasn't particle shielded. However, it is completely ray shielded. That means no energy beams. You'll have to use proton torpedoes. A few of the pilots laughed humorously. One of them was a teenage fighter jockey seated next to Luke, who bore the unlikely name of Wedge Antilles. R2-D2 was there also, seated next to another R2 unit who emitted a long whistle of hopelessness. A 2-meter target at maximum speed with a torpedo yet, Antilles snorted. That's impossible, even for the computer. But it's not impossible, protested Luke. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters. Is that so? The rakishly uniformed youth noted derisively. Tell me, when you were going after your particular varmint, were there 1,000 other, what did you call it, womp rats, armed with power rifles firing up at you? He shook his head sadly. With all that firepower in the station directed at us, this will take a little more than barnyard marksmanship, believe me. As if to confirm Antilles' pessimism, Dodonna indicated a string of lights on the ever-changing schematic. Take special note of these emplacements. There's a heavy concentration of firepower on the latitudinal axis, as well as several dense circumpolar clusters. Also, their field generators will probably create a lot of distortion, especially in and around the trench. I figure that maneuverability in that sector will be less than .3. This produced more murmurs and a few groans from the assembly. Remember, the general went on, you must achieve a direct hit. Yellow Squadron will cover for red on the first run. Green will cover blue on the second. Any questions? A muted buzz filled the room. One man stood, lean and handsome, too much so, it seemed, to be ready to throw away his life for something as abstract as freedom. What if both runs fail? What happens after that? Dodonna smiled tightly. There won't be any after that. The man nodded slowly, understandingly, and sat down. Anyone else? Silence now, pregnant with expectation. Then man your ships, and may the force be with you. Like oil draining from a shallow pot, the seated ranks of men, women, and machines rose and flowed toward the exits. Elevators hummed busily, lifting more and more deadly shapes from buried depths of the staging area in the primary temple hangar, as Luke, 3PO, and R2-D2 walked toward the hangar entrance. Neither the bustling flight crews, nor the pilots performing final checkouts, nor the mass of sparks thrown off as power couplings were disconnected, captured Luke's attention at the moment. Instead, it was held by the activity of two far more familiar figures. Solo and Chewbacca were loading a pile of small strong boxes onto an armored land speeder. They were completely absorbed with this activity, ignoring the preparations going on all around them. Solo glanced up briefly as Luke and the robots approached, then returned to his loading. Luke simply watched sadly, conflicting emotions careening confusedly off one another inside him. Solo was cocky, reckless, intolerant, and smug. He was also brave to a fault, instructive, and unfailingly cheery. The combination made for a confusing friend, but a friend nonetheless. You got your reward, Luke finally observed, indicating the boxes. Solo nodded once. And you're leaving then? That's right, kid. I got some old debts to pay off, and even if I didn't, I don't think I'd be fool enough to stick around here. He eyed Luke appraisingly. You're pretty good in a scrap, kid. Why don't you come with us? I could use you. The mercenary gleam in Solo's eyes only made Luke mad. Why don't you look around you and see something else besides yourself for a change? You know what's going to happen here, what they're up against. They could use a good pilot, but you're turning your back on them. Solo didn't appear upset at Luke's tirade. What good's a reward if you're not around to spend it? Attacking that battle station isn't my idea of courage. More like suicide. Yeah. Take care of yourself, Han, Luke said quietly, turning to leave. But I guess that's what you're best at, isn't it? He started back into the hangar depths, flanked by the two droids. Solo stared after him, hesitated, then called. Hey, Luke. May the force be with you. Luke looked back to see Solo wink at him. He waved. Sort of. Then he was swallowed up by moving mechanics and machinery. Solo returned to his work, lifted a box, and stopped to see Chewbacca gazing fixedly at him. What are you staring at, Gruesome? I know what I'm doing. Get back to work. Slowly, still eyeing his partner, the Wookiee returned to the task of loading the heavy crates. Sorrowful thoughts of Solo vanished when Luke saw the petite, slim figure standing by his ship, the ship he had been granted. Are you sure this is what you want? Princess Leia asked him. It could be a deadly reward. Luke's eyes were filled with a sleek, venomous metal shape. More than anything. Then what's wrong? Luke looked back at her and shrugged. It's Han. I thought he'd change his mind. I thought he'd join us. A man must follow his own path, she told him, sounding now like a senator. No one can choose it for him. Han Solo's priorities differ from ours. I wish it were otherwise, but I can't find it in my heart to condemn him. She stood on tiptoes, gave him a quick, almost embarrassed kiss, and turned to go. May the Force be with you. I only wish, Luke murmured to himself as he started back to his ship. Ben were here. So intent was he on thoughts of Kenobi, the princess, and Han, that he didn't notice the larger figure which tightly locked onto his arm. He turned, his initial anger gone instantly in astonishment as he recognized the figure. Luke! The slightly older man exclaimed. I don't believe it. How'd you get here? Are you going out with us? Biggs! Luke embraced his friend warmly. Of course he'll be up there with you. His smile faded slightly. I haven't got a choice anymore. Then he brightened again. Listen, have I got some stories to tell you? The steady whooping and laughing the two made was in marked contrast to the solemnity with which the other men and women in the hangar went about their business. The commotion attracted the attention of an older, war-torn man known to the younger pilots only as Blue Leader. His face wrinkled with curiosity as he approached the two younger men. It was a face scorched by the same fire that flickered in his eyes, a blaze kindled not by revolutionary fervor, but by years of living through and witnessing far too much injustice. Behind that fatherly visage a raging demon fought to escape. Soon, very soon, he'd be free to let it loose. Now he was interested in these two young men, who in a few hours were likely to be particles of frozen meat floating about Yavin. One of them he recognized. Aren't you Luke Skywalker? Have you been checked out on the Incom T-65? Sir, Biggs put in before his friend could reply. Luke's the best bush pilot in the Outer Rim territories. The older man patted Luke reassuringly on the back as they studied his waiting ship. Something to be proud of. I've got over 1,000 hours in an Incom Skyhopper myself. He paused a moment before going on. I met your father once when I was just a boy, Luke. He was a great pilot. You'll do all right out there. If you got half your father's skill, you'll do a damn sight better than all right. Thank you, sir. I'll try. There's not much difference control-wise between an X-Wing T-65, Blue Leader went on, and a Skyhopper. His smile turned ferocious, except the payloads of a somewhat different nature. He left them and hurried toward his own ship. Luke had 100 questions to ask him, and no time for even one. I've got to get aboard my own boat, Luke. Listen, you'll tell me your stories when we come back, all right? All right. I told you I'd make it here someday, Biggs. You did. His friend was moving toward a cluster of waiting fighters, adjusting his flight suit. It's going to be like old times, Luke. We're a couple of shooting stars that can't be stopped. Luke laughed. They used to reassure themselves with that cry when they piloted starships of sandhills and dead logs behind the flaking, pitted buildings of Anchorhead. Years and years ago. Once more Luke turned toward his ship, admiring its deadly lines. Despite Blue Leader's assurances, he had to admit that it didn't look much like an Incom Skyhopper. R2-D2 was being snuggled into the R2 socket behind the fighter cockpit. A forlorn metal figure stood below, watching the operation and shuffling nervously about. Hold on tight, C-3PO was cautioning the smaller robot. You've got to come back. If you don't come back, who am I going to have to yell at? For 3PO, that query amounted to an overwhelming burst of emotion. R2 beeped confidently down at his friend, however, as Luke mounted the cockpit entry. Farther down the hangar he saw Blue Leader already set in his acceleration chair and signaling to his ground crew. Another roar was added to the monstrous din filling the hangar area, as ship after ship activated its engines. In that enclosed rectangle of temple, the steady thunder was overpowering. Slipping into the cockpit seat, Luke studied the various controls as ground attendants began wiring him via cords and umbilicals into the ship. His confidence increased steadily. The instrumentation was necessarily simplified, and, as Blue Leader had indicated, much like his old Skyhopper. Something patted his helmet, and he glanced left to see the crew chief leaning close. He had a shout to be heard above the deafening howl of multiple engines. That R2 unit of yours seems a little beat up. Do you want a new one? Luke glanced briefly back at the secured droid before replying. R2-D2 looked like a permanent piece of the fighter. Not on your life. That droid and I have been through a lot together. All secure, R2? The droid replied with a reassuring beat. As the ground chief jumped clear, Luke commenced the final checkout of all instruments. It slowly occurred to him what he and the others were about to attempt. Not that his personal feelings could override his decision to join them. He was no longer an individual, functioning solely to satisfy his personal needs. Something now bound him to every other man and woman in this hangar. All around him, scattered scenes of goodbye were taking place, some serious, some kidding, all with the true emotion of the moment masked by efficiency. Luke turned away from where one pilot left a mechanic, possibly a sister or wife, or just a friend, with a sharp, passionate kiss. He wondered how many of them had their own little debts to settle with the Empire. Something crackled in his helmet. In response, he touched a small lever. The ship began to roll forward, slowly but with increasing speed, toward the gaping mouth of the temple. 12. Leia Organa sat silently before the huge display screen on which Yavin and its moons were displayed. A large red dot moved steadily toward the fourth of those satellites. Dodonna and several other field commanders of the Alliance stood behind her, their eyes also intent on the screen. Tiny green flecks began to appear around the fourth moon, to coalesce into small clouds like hovering emerald gnats. Dodonna put a hand on her shoulder. It was comforting. The red represents the progress of the Imperial battle station as it moves deeper into Yavin's system. Our ships are all away, a commander behind him declared. A single man stood alone in the cylindrical hold, secured to the top of a rapier-thin tower. Staring through fixed and mounted electrobinoculars, he was the sole visible representative of the vast technology buried in the green purgatory below. Muted cries, moans, and primeval gurglings drifted up to him from the highest treetops. Some were frightening, some less so, but none were as indicative of power held in check as the four silvery starships which burst into view above the observer. Keeping a tight formation, they exploded through humid air to vanish in seconds into the morning cloud cover far above. Sound shadows rattled the trees moments later in a forlorn attempt to catch up to the engines which had produced them. Slowly assuming attack formations combining X and Y-wing ships, the various fighters began to move outward from the moon, out past the oceanic atmosphere of giant Yavin, out to meet the technological executioner. The man who had observed the byplay between Biggs and Luke now lowered his glare visor and adjusted his half-automatic, half-manual gun sights as he checked the ships to either side of him. "Blue boys," he addressed his intership pickup. "This is Blue Leader. Adjust your selectors and check in. Approaching target at 1.3. Ahead, the bright sphere of what looked like one of Yavin's moons, but wasn't, began to glow with increasing brightness. It shone with an eerie metallic glow, utterly unlike that of any natural satellite. As he watched the giant battle station make its way around the rim of Yavin, Blue Leader's thoughts traveled back over the years. Over the uncountable injustices, the innocents taken away for interrogation and never heard from again, the whole multitude of evils incurred by an increasingly corrupt and indifferent imperial government. All those terrors and agonies were concentrated, magnified, represented by the single bloated feat of engineering they were approaching now. "This is it, boys," he said to the mic. "Blue 2, you're too far out. Close it up, Wedge." The young pilot Luke had encountered in the temple briefing room glanced to starboard, then back to his instruments. He executed a slight adjustment, frowning. "Sorry, boss. My ranger seems to have a few points off. I'll have to go on manual." "Check, Blue 2. Watch yourself. All ships stand by to lock S-foils in attack mode." One after another, from Luke and Biggs, Wedge, and the other members of Blue Assault Squadron, the replies came back. "Standing by." "Execute," Blue Leader commanded, when John D. and Piggy had indicated they were in readiness. The double wings on the X-wing fighters split apart, like narrow seeds. Each fighter now displayed 4 wings, its wing-mounted armament and quadruple engines now deployed for maximum firepower and maneuverability. Ahead, the Imperial station continued to grow. Surface features became visible as each pilot recognized docking bays, broadcast antenna, and other man-made mountains and canyons. As he neared that threatening black sphere for the second time, Luke's breathing grew faster. Automatic life support machinery detected the respiratory shift and compensated properly. Something began to buffet his ship, almost as if he were back in his skyhopper again, wrestling with the unpredictable winds of Tatooine. He experienced a bad moment of uncertainty until the calming voice of Blue Leader sounded in his ears. "We're passing through their outer shields. Hold tight. Lock down freeze floating controls and switch your own deflectors on. Double front." The shaking and buffeting continued, worsened. Not knowing how to compensate, Luke did exactly what he should have, remained in control and followed orders. Then the turbulence was gone and the deathly cold peacefulness of space had returned. "That's it, we're through," Blue Leader told them quietly. "Keep all channels silent until we're on top of them. It doesn't look like they're expecting much resistance." Though half the great station remained in shadow, they were now near enough for Luke to be able to discern individual lights on its surface. A ship that could show phases matching the moon. Once again he marveled at the misplaced ingenuity and effort which had gone into its construction. Thousands of lights scattered across its curving expanse gave it the appearance of a floating city. Some of Luke's comrades, since this was their first sight of the station, were even more impressed. "Look at the size of that thing," Wedge Antilles gasped over his open pickup. "Cut the chatter, Blue 2, Blue Leader ordered. "Accelerate to attack velocity." Grim determination showed in Luke's expression as he flipped several switches above his head and began adjusting his computer target readout. R2-D2 re-examined the nearing station and thought untranslatable electronic thoughts. Blue Leader compared the station with the location of their proposed target area. "Red Leader," he called toward the pickup. "This is Blue Leader. We're in position. You can go right in. The exhaust shaft is farther to the north. We'll keep 'em busy down here." Red Leader was the physical opposite of Luke's squadron commander. He resembled the popular notion of a credit accountant. Short, slim, shy of face. His skills and dedication, however, easily matched those of his counterpart and old friend. "We're starting for the target shaft now, Dutch. Stand by to take over if anything happens." "Check, Red Leader," came the other's reply. "We're going to cross their equatorial axis and try to draw their main fire. May the Force be with you." From the approaching swarm, 2 squads of fighters broke clear. The X-Wing ships drove directly for the bulge of the station, far below, while the Y ships curved down and northward over its surface. Within the station, alarm sirens began a mournful, clangorous wail, as slow-to-react personnel realized that the impregnable fortress was actually under organized attack. Admiral Mahdi and his tacticians had expected the rebels' resistance to be centered around a massive defense of the moon itself. They were completely unprepared for an offensive response consisting of dozens of tiny snub fighters. Imperial efficiency was in the process of compensating for this strategic oversight. Soldiers scrambled to man enormous defensive weapons emplacements. Servo drivers thrummed as powerful motors aligned the huge devices for firing. Soon, a web of annihilation began to develop the station, as energy weapons, electrical bolts, and explosive solids ripped out at the oncoming rebel craft. "This is Blue 5, Luke announced to his mic as he nose-dived his ship in a radical attempt to confuse any electronic predicators below. The gray surface of the battle station streaked past his ports. "I'm going in." "I'm right behind you, Blue 5, a voice recognizable as Biggs sounded in his ears. The target in Luke's sights was as stable as that of the Imperial defenders was evasive. Bolts flew from the tiny vessel's weapons. One started a huge fire on the dim surface below, which would burn until the crew of the station could shut off the flow of air to the damaged section. Luke's glee turned to terror as he realized he couldn't swerve his craft in time to avoid passing through the fireball of unknown composition. "Pull out, Luke, pull out!" Biggs was screaming at him. But despite commands to shift course, the automatic pressers wouldn't allow the necessary centrifugal force. His fighter plunged into the expanding ball of superheated gases. Then he was through and clear, on the other side. A rapid check of his controls enabled him to relax. Passage through the intense heat had been insufficient to damage anything vital, though all 4 wings bore streaks of black, carbonized testimony to the nearness of his escape. Hellflowers bloomed outside his ship as he swung it up and around in a sharp curve. "You all right, Luke?" came Biggs' concerned query. "I got a little toasted, but I'm okay." A different, stern voice sounded. "Blue 5, warned the squadron leader, "you'd better give yourself more lead time, or you're going to destroy yourself as well as the Imperial construction." "Yes, sir. I've got the hang of it now. Like you said, it's not exactly like flying a skyhopper." Energy bolts and sun-bright beams continued to create a chromatic maze in the space above the station as the rebel fighters crisscrossed back and forth over its surface, firing at whatever looked like a decent target. Two of the tiny craft concentrated on a power terminal. It blew up, throwing lightning-sized electrical arcs from the station's innards. Inside, troopers, mechanicals, and equipment were blown in all directions by subsidiary explosions as the effects of the blast traveled back down various conduits and cables. Where the explosion had hulled the station, escaping atmosphere sucked helpless soldiers and droids out into a bottomless black tomb. Moving from position to position, a figure of dark calm amid the chaos, was Darth Vader. A harried commander rushed up to him and reported breathlessly, "Lord Vader, we count at least 30 of them, of two types. They are so small and quick the fixed guns cannot follow them accurately. They continuously evade the Predicators." "Get all TIE crews to their fighters. We'll have to go out after them and destroy them ship by ship." Within numerous hangars, red lights began flashing and an insistent alarm started to ring. Ground crews worked frantically to ready ships as flight-suited Imperial pilots grabbed for helmets and packs. "Luke," requested Blue Leader as he skimmed smoothly through a rain of fire, "let me know when you're off the block." "I'm on my way now." "Watch yourself," the voice urged of the cockpit speaker. "There's a lot of fire coming from the starboard side of the deflection tower." "I'm on it, don't worry," Luke responded confidently. Putting his fighter into a twisting dive, he sliced once more across metal horizons. Antennae and small protruding emplacements burst into transitory flame as bolts from his wingtips stuck with deadly accuracy. He grinned as he pulled up and away from the surface as intense lines of energy passed through space recently vacated. Darned if it wasn't like hunting womp rats back home in the crumbling canyons of Tatooine's wastes. Biggs followed Luke on a similar run, even as Imperial pilots prepared to lift clear of the station. Within the many docking bays, technical crews rushed hurriedly to unlock power cables and conclude desperate final checks. More care was taken in preparing a particular craft nearest one of the bay ports, the one into which Darth Vader barely succeeded in squeezing his huge frame. Once set in the seat, he slid a second set of eye shields over his face. The atmosphere of the war room back in the temple was one of nervous expectancy. Occasional blinks and buzzes from the main battle screen sounded louder than the soft susurration of hopeful people trying to reassure one another. Near a far corner of the mass of flickering lights, a technician leaned a little closer to his own readouts before speaking into the pickup suspended near his mouth. "Squad leaders, attention, squad leaders, attention. We've picked up a new set of signals from the other side of the station. Enemy fighters coming your way." Luke received the report at the same time as everyone else. He began hunting the sky for the predicted Imperial craft, his gaze dropping to his instrumentation. "My scope's negative. I don't see anything." "Maintain visual scanning," Blue Leader directed. "With all this energy flying, they'll be on top of you before your scope can pick them up. Remember, they can jam every instrument on your ship except your eyes." Luke turned again, and this time saw an Imperial already pursuing an X-Wing. An X-Wing with a number Luke quickly recognized. "Biggs!" he shouted. "You picked one up. On your tail. Watch it." "I can't see it," came his friend's panicked response. "Where is he? I can't see it." Luke watched helplessly as Biggs' ship shot away from the station's surface and out into clear space, closely followed by the Imperial. The enemy vessel fired steadily at him, each successive bolt seeming to pass a little closer to Biggs' hull. "He's on me tight," the voice sounded in Luke's cockpit. "I can't shake him." Twisting, spinning, Biggs looped back toward the battle station, but the pilot trailing him was persistent and showed no sign of relinquishing pursuit. "Hang on, Biggs," Luke called, wrenching his ship around so steeply that straining gyros whined. "I'm coming in." So absorbed in his pursuit of Biggs was the Imperial pilot that he didn't see Luke, who rotated his own ship, flipped out of the concealing gray below, and dropped in behind him. Electronic crosshairs lined up according to the computer readout instructions, and Luke fired repeatedly. There was a small explosion in space, tiny compared with the enormous energies being put out by the emplacements on the surface of the battle station, but the explosion was of particular significance to three people: Luke, Biggs, and most particularly to the pilot of the TIE fighter, who was vaporized with his ship. "Got him," Luke murmured. I've got one," came a less restrained cry of triumph over the open intercom. Luke identified the voice as belonging to a young pilot known as John D. Yes, that was Blue Six chasing another Imperial fighter across the metal landscape. Bolts jumped from the X-Wing in steady succession until the TIE fighter blew in half, sending leaf-like glittering metal fragments flying in all directions. "Good shooting, Blue 6, the squadron leader commented. Then he added quickly, "Watch out, you got one on your tail." Within the fighter's cockpit, the gleeful smile on the young man's face vanished instantly as he looked around, unable to spot his pursuer. Something flared brightly nearby, so close that his starboard port burst. Then something hit even closer, and the interior of the now open cockpit became a mass of flames. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" That was all he had time to scream before oblivion took him from behind. Far above and to one side, Blue Leader saw John D's ship expand in a fiery ball. His lips may have whitened slightly. Otherwise, he might as well never have seen the X-Wing explode for all the reaction he displayed. He had had more important things to do. On the fourth moon of Yavin, a spacious screen chose that moment to flicker and die, much as John D. had. Worried technicians began rushing in all directions. One turned a drawn face to Leia, the expectant commanders, and one tall, bronzed robot. "The high-band receiver has failed. It will take some time to fix." "Do the best you can," Leia snapped. "Switch to audio only." Someone overheard, and in seconds the room was filled with the sounds of distant battle, interspersed with the voices of those involved. "Tighten it up, Blue 2. Tighten it up," Blue Leader was saying. "Watch those towers." "Heavy fire, boss," came the voice of Wedge Antilles. 23 degrees. "I see it. Pull in. Pull in. We're picking up some interference." "I can't believe it," Biggs was stammering. "I've never seen such firepower." "Pull in, Blue 5. Pull in." A pause, then, "Luke, do you read me? Luke." "I'm all right, Chief," came Luke's reply. "I've got a target. I'm going to check it out." "There's too much action down there, Luke," Biggs told him. "Get out. Do you read me, Luke? Pull out." "Break off, Luke," ordered the deeper tones of Blue Leader. "We've hit too much interference here. Luke, I repeat, break off. I can't see 'em. Blue 2, can you see Blue 5? "Negative," Wedge replied quickly. "There's a fire zone here you wouldn't believe. My scanner's jammed. Blue 5, where are you? Luke, are you all right?" "He's gone." Biggs started to report solemnly. Then his voice rose. "No. Wait. There he is. Looks like a little fin damage, but the kid's fine." Relief swept the war room, and it was most noticeable on the face of the slightest, most beautiful senator present. On the battle station, troopers worn half to death or deafened by the concussion of the big guns were replaced by fresh crews. None of them had time to wonder how the battle was going, and at the moment none of them much cared. A malady shared by common soldiers since the dawn of history. Luke skimmed daringly low over the station's surface, his attention riveted on a distant metal projector. "Stick close, Blue 5, the squadron commander directed him. "Where are you going?" "I've picked up what looks like a lateral stabilizer," Luke replied. "I'm going to try for it." "Watch yourself, Blue 5. Heavy fire in your area." Luke ignored the warning as he headed the fighter straight toward the oddly shaped protuberance. His determination was rewarded when, after saturating it with fire, he saw it erupt in a spectacular ball of super-hot gas. "Got it!" he exclaimed, continuing south for another one. Within the rebel temple fortress, Leia listened intently. She seemed simultaneously angry and frightened. Finally, she turned to 3PO and muttered, "Why is Luke taking so many chances?" The tall droid didn't reply. "Watch your back, Luke," Biggs' voice sounded above the speakers. "Watch your back. Fighters above you, coming in." Leia strained to see what she could only hear. She wasn't alone. "Help him, R2, 3PO was whispering to himself, "and keep holding on." Luke continued his dive, even as he looked back and spotted the object of Biggs' concern close on his tail. Reluctantly, he pulled up and away from the station's surface, abandoning his target. His tormentor was good, however, and continued closing on him. "I can't shake him," he reported. Something cut across the sky toward both ships. "I'm on him, Luke," shouted Wedge Antilles. "Hold on." Luke didn't have to for very long. Wedge's gunnery was precise, and the TIE fighter vanished brightly shortly thereafter. "Thanks, Wedge," Luke murmured, breathing a little more easily. "Good shooting, Wedge." That was Biggs again. "Blue 4, I'm going in. Cover me, Porkins." "I'm right with you, Blue 3, came the other pilot's assurance. Biggs leveled them off, let go with full weaponry. No one ever decided exactly what it was he hit, but the small tower that blew up under his energy bolts was obviously more important than it looked. A series of sequential explosions hopscotched across a large section of the battle station's surface, leaping from one terminal to the next. Biggs had already shot past the area of disturbance, but his companion, following slightly behind, received a full dose of whatever energy was running wild down there. "I've got a problem," Porkins announced. "My converter's running wild." That was an understatement. Every instrument on his control panels had abruptly gone berserk. "Eject! Eject, Blue 4," advised Biggs. "Blue 4, do you read?" "I'm okay," Porkins replied. "I can hold her. Give me a little room to run, Biggs." "You're too low," his companion yelled. "Pull up! Pull up!" With his instrumentation not providing proper information, and at the altitude he was traveling, Porkinson's ship was simple for one of the big, clumsy gun emplacements to track. It did as its designers had intended it should. Porkins's demise was as glorious as it was abrupt. It was comparatively quiet near the pole of the battle station. So intense and vicious had been Blue and Green Squadron's assault on the equator that Imperial resistance had concentrated there. Red leaders surveyed the false peace with mournful satisfaction, knowing it wouldn't last for long. "Blue leader, this is Red leader," he announced into his mic. "We're starting our attack run. The exhaust port is located and marked. No flak, no enemy fighters up here. Yet. Looks like we'll get at least one smooth run at it." "I copy, Red leader," the voice of his counterpart responded. "We'll try to keep them busy down here." 3 Y-wing fighters dropped out of the stars, diving toward the battle station's surface. At the last possible minute, they swerved to dip into a deep artificial canyon, one of many streaking the northern pole of the Death Star. Metal ramparts raced past on 3 sides of them. Red leader hunted around, noticed the temporary absence of Imperial fighters. He adjusted a control and addressed his squadron. "This is it, boys. Remember, when you think you're close, go in closer before you drop that rock. Switch all power to the front deflector screens. Never mind what they throw at you from the side. We can't worry about that now." Imperial crews lining the trench rudely awoke to the fact that their heretofore ignored section of the station was coming under attack. They reacted speedily, and soon energy bolts were racing at the attacking ships in a steadily increasing volume. Occasionally, one would explode near one of the onrushing Y-wings, jostling it without real damage. "A little aggressive, aren't they?" Red 2 reported over his mic. Red leader reacted quietly. "How many guns do you think, Red 5? Red 5, known casually to most of the rebel pilots as Pops, somehow managed to make an estimate of the trench's defenses while simultaneously piloting his fighter through the growing hail of fire. His helmet was battered almost to the point of uselessness from the effects of more battles than anyone had a right to survive. "I'd say about 20 emplacements," he finally decided, "some on the surface and some on the towers." Red leader acknowledged the information with a grunt as he pulled his computer targeting visor down in front of his face. Explosions continued to rock the fighter. "Switch to targeting computers," he declared. "Red 2, came one reply. "Computer locked in, and I'm getting a signal." The young pilot's rising excitement marked his reply. But the sensor pilot among all the rebels, Red 5, was expectantly cool and confident, though it didn't sound like it from what he murmured half to himself. "No doubt about it, this is going to be some trick." Unexpectedly, all defensive fire from the surrounding emplacements ceased. An eerie quiet clung to the trench as the surface continued to blur past the skimming Y-wings. "What's this?" Red 2 blurted, looking around worriedly. They stopped. "Why?" "I don't like it," growled Red leader. But there was nothing to confuse their approach now, no energy bolts to avoid. It was Pops who was first to properly evaluate this seeming aberration on the enemy's part. "Stabilize your rear deflectors now. Watch for enemy fighters." "You pinned it, Pops," Red leader admitted, studying a readout. "Here they come. 3 marks at 210. A mechanical voice continued to recite the shrinking distance to their target, but it wasn't shrinking fast enough. "We're sitting ducks down here," he observed nervously. "We'll just have to ride it out," the old man told them all. "We can't defend ourselves and go for the target at the same time." He fought down old reflexes as his own screen revealed 3 TIE fighters in precision formation, diving almost vertically down toward them. 38104, Darth Vader announced as he calmly adjusted his controls. The stars whipped past behind him. "I'll take them myself. Cover me." Red 2 was the first to die, the young pilot never knowing what hit him, never seeing his executioner. Despite his experience, Red leader was on the verge of panic when he saw his wingman dissolve in flame. "We're trapped down here. No way to maneuver. Trench walls are too close. We gotta loosen it up somehow. "Stay on target," admonished an older voice. "Stay on target." Red Leader took Pop's words like tonic, but it was all he could do to ignore the closing TIE fighters as the two remaining Y-Wings continued to streak toward the target. Above them, Vader permitted himself a moment of undisciplined pleasure as he readjusted his targeting computer. The rebel craft continued to travel straight unevasive course. Again, Vader touched finger to fire control. Something screeched in Red Leader's helmet, and fire started to consume his instrumentation. "It's no good," he yelled into his pickup. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" A second Y-Wing exploded in a ball of vaporized metal, scattering a few solid shards of debris across the trench. This second loss proved too much even for Red 5 to take. He manipulated controls, and his ship commenced rising in a slow curve out of the trench. Behind him, the lead Imperial fighter moved to follow. "Red 5 to Blue Leader," he reported. "A boarding run under heavy fire. TIE fighters dropped on us out of nowhere. I can't... Wait!" Astern, a silent, remorseless enemy was touching a deadly button once more. The first bolt stuck just as Pops had risen high enough to commence evasive action, but he had pulled clear a few seconds too late. One energy beam seared his port engine, igniting gas within. The engine blew apart, taking controls and stabilizing elements with it. Unable to compensate, the out-of-control Y-Wing began a long, graceful plunge toward the station's surface. "Are you all right, Red 5? A troubled voice called over the intership system. "Lost Teary. Lost Dutch," Pops explained slowly, tiredly. "They drop in behind you, and you can't maneuver in the trench. Sorry, it's your baby now. So long, Dave." It was the last message of many from a veteran. Blue Leader forced a crispness he didn't feel into his voice as he tried to shunt aside the death of his old friend. "Blue boys, this is Blue Leader. Rendezvous at Mark 6.1. All wings report in." "Blue Leader, this is Blue 10. I copy." "Blue 2 here," Wedge acknowledged. "Coming toward you, Blue Leader." Luke was also waiting his turn to report when something beeped on his control board. A glance backward confirmed the electronic warning as he spotted an Imperial fighter slipping in behind him. "This is Blue 5, he declared, his ship wobbling as he tried to lose the TIE fighter. "I have a problem here. Be right with you." He sent his ship into a steep dive toward the metal surface, then cut sharply up to avoid a burst of defensive fire from the emplacements below. Neither maneuver shook his pursuit. "I see you, Luke," came a reassuring call from Biggs. "Stay with it." Luke looked above, below, and to the sides, but there was no sign of his friend. Meanwhile, energy bolts from his trailing assailant were passing uncomfortably close. "Blast it, Biggs! Where are you?" Something appeared, not to the sides or behind, but almost directly in front of him. It was bright and moving incredibly fast, and then it was firing just above him. Taken completely by surprise, the Imperial fighter came apart just as its pilot realized what had happened. Luke turned for the rendezvous mark as Biggs shot past overhead. "Good move, Biggs. Fooled me, too." "I'm just getting started," his friend announced as he twisted his ship violently to avoid the fire from below. He hove into view over Luke's shoulder and executed a victory roll. "Just point me at the target." Back alongside Yavin's indifferent bulk, Dodonna finished an intense discussion with several of his principal advisors, then moved to the long-range transmitter. "Blue Leader, this is Base 1. Double-check your own attack prior to commencement. Have your wingmen hold back and cover for you. Keep half your group out of range to make the next run." "Copy, Base 1," the response came. "Blue 10, Blue 12, join with me." Two ships leveled off to flank the squadron commander. Blue Leader checked them out. Satisfied that they were positioned properly for the attack run, he set the group to follow in case they should fail. "Blue 5, this is Blue Leader. Luke, take Blue 2 and Blue 3 with you. Hold up here out of their fire and wait for my signal to start your own run." "Copy, Blue Leader," Luke acknowledged, trying to slow his heart slightly. "May the Force be with you. Biggs, Wedge, let's close it up." Together, the three fighters assumed a tight formation, high above the firefight still raging between other rebel craft, of green and yellow squadrons, and the Imperial gunners below. The horizon flip-flopped ahead of Blue Leader as he commenced his approach to the station surface. "Blue 10, Blue 12, stay back until we spot those fighters, then cover me." All three X-Wings reached the surface, leveled off, then arced into the trench. His wingmen dropped farther and farther behind until Blue Leader was seemingly alone in the vast gray chasm. No defensive fire greeted him as he raced toward the distant target. He found himself looking around nervously, checking and rechecking the same instruments. "This doesn't look right," he found himself muttering. Blue 10 sounded equally concerned. You should be able to pick up the target by now. I know. The disruption down here is unbelievable. I think my instruments are off. Is this the right trench? Suddenly, intense streaks of light began to shoot close by as the trench defenses opened up. Near misses shook the attackers. At the far end of the trench, a huge tower dominated the metal ridge, vomiting enormous amounts of energy at the nearing ships. It's not going to be easy with that tower up there, Blue Leader declared grimly. Stand by to close up a little when I tell you. Abruptly, the energy bolts ceased and all was silent and dark in the trench once again. This is it, Blue Leader announced, trying to locate the attack from above that had to be coming. Keep your eyes open for those fighters. All short and long-range scopes are blank, Blue 10 reported tensely. Too much interference here. Blue 5, can you see them from where you are? Luke's attention was riveted to the surface of the station. No sign of... Wait! 3 rapidly moving points of light caught his eye. There they are, coming in .35. Blue 10 turned and looked in the indicated direction. Sun bounced off stabilizing fins as the TIE fighters looped downward. I see them. It's the right trench, all right, Blue Leader exclaimed as his tracking scope suddenly began a steady beeping. He adjusted his targeting instrumentation, pulling the visor down over his eyes. I'm almost in range. Target's ready. Coming up. Just hold them off for me for a few seconds. Keep 'em busy. But Darth Vader was already setting his own fire control as he dropped like a stone toward the trench. Close up the formation. I'll take them myself. Blue 12 went first, both engines blown. A slight deviation in flight path and his ship slammed into the trench wall. Blue 10 slowed and accelerated, bobbed drunkenly, but could do little within the confines of those metal walls. I can't hold them long. You better fire while you can, Blue Leader. We're closing on you. The squadron commander was wholly absorbed in lining up 2 circles within their targeting visor. We're almost home. Steady. Steady. Blue 10 glanced around frantically. They're right behind me. Blue Leader was amazed at how calm he was. The targeting device was partly responsible, enabling him to concentrate on tiny, abstract images to the exclusion of all else, helping him to shut out the rest of the inimical universe. Almost there. Almost there, he whispered. Then the 2 circles matched, turned red, and a steady buzzing sounded in his helmet. Torpedoes away! Torpedoes away! Immediately after, Blue 10 let his own missiles loose. Both fighters pulled up sharply, just clearing the end of the trench as several explosions billowed in their wake. It's a hit! We've done it! Blue 10 shouted hysterically. Blue Leader's reply was thick with disappointment. No, we haven't. They didn't go in. They just exploded on the surface outside the shaft. Disappointment killed them, too, as they neglected to watch behind them. 3 pursuing Imperial fighters continued up out of the fading light from the torpedo explosions. Blue 10 fell to Vader's precision fire, then the Dark Lord changed course slightly to fall in behind the squadron commander. I'll take the last one, he announced coldly. You 2 go back. Luke was trying to pick the assault team out of the glowing gases below when Blue Leader's voice sounded over the communicator. Blue 5, this is Blue Leader. Move into position, Luke. Start your attack run. Stay low and wait until you're right on top of it. It's not going to be easy. Are you all right? They're on top of me, but I'll shake them. Blue 5 to Blue Pack, Luke ordered. Let's go. The 3 ships peeled off and plunged toward the trench sector. Meanwhile, Vader finally succeeded in hitting his quarry, a glancing blow that nonetheless started small, intense explosions in one engine. Its R2 unit scrambled back toward the damaged wing and struggled to repair the crippled power plant. R2, shut off the main feed to number 1 starboard engine, Blue Leader directed quietly, staring resignedly at instruments which were running and possibilities. Hang on tight, this could get rough. Luke saw that Blue Leader was in trouble. We're right above you, Blue Leader, he declared. Turn to point .05 and we'll cover for you. I've lost my upper starboard engine, came the reply. We'll come down for you. Negative. Negative. Stay there and get set up for your attack run. You're sure you're all right? I think so. Stand by for a minute. Actually, it was somewhat less than a minute before Blue Leader's gyrating X-Wing plowed into the surface of the station. Luke watched the huge explosion dissipate below him, knowing without question its cause, sensing fully for the first time the helplessness of his situation. We just lost Blue Leader, he murmured absently, not particularly caring if his mic picked up the somber announcement. On Yavin 4, Leia Organa rose from her chair and nervously began pacing the room. Normally perfect nails were now jagged and uneven from nervous chewing. It was the only indication of physical unease. The anxiety visible in her expression was far more revealing of her feelings, an anxiety and worry that filled the war room on the announcement of Blue Leader's death. "Can they go on?" she finally asked Dodonna. The general replied with gentle resolve. "They must." "But we've lost so many. Without Blue or Red Leader, how will they regroup?" Dodonna was about to reply, but held his words as more critical ones sounded over the speakers. "Close it up, Wedge," Luke was saying, thousands of kilometers away. "Biggs, where are you?" "Coming in right behind you." Wedge replied soon thereafter. "Okay, boss, we're in position." Dodonna's gaze went to Leia. He looked concerned. The three X-Wings moved close together, high above the battle station's surface. Luke studied his instruments and fought irritably with one control that appeared to be malfunctioning. Someone's voice sounded in his ears. It was a young, old voice, a familiar voice, calm, content, confident and reassuring, a voice he had listened to intently on the desert of Tatooine and in the guts of the station below, once upon a time. "Trust your feelings, Luke," was all the Kenobi-like voice said. Luke tapped his helmet, unsure whether he had heard anything or not. This was no time for introspection. The steely horizon of the station tilted behind him. "Wedge, Biggs, we're going in," he told his wingmen. "We'll go in full speed. Never mind finding the trench and then accelerating. Maybe that will keep those fighters far enough behind us." "We'll stay far enough back to cover you," Biggs declared. "At that speed, will you be able to pull out in time?" "Are you kidding?" Luke sneered playfully as they began their dive toward the surface. "It'll be just like Beggar's Canyon back home." "I'm right with you, boss," noted Wedge, emphasizing the title for the first time. "Let's go." At high speed, the three slim fighters charged the glowing surface, pulling out after the last moment. Luke skimmed so close over the station hull that the tip of one wing grazed a protruding antenna, sending metal splinters flying. Instantly, they were enveloped in a meshwork of energy bolts and explosive projectiles. It intensified as they dropped down into the trench. "We seem to have upset them," Biggs chortled, treating the deadly display of energy as though it were all a show being put on for their amusement. "This is fine," Luke commented, surprised at the clear view ahead. "I can see everything." Wedge wasn't quite as confident as he studied his own readouts. "My scope shows the tower, but I can't make out the exhaust port. It must be awfully small. Are you sure the computer can target it?" "It better," Biggs muttered. Luke didn't offer an evaluation. He was too busy holding a course through the turbulence produced by exploding bolts. Then, as if on command, the defensive fire ceased. He glanced around and up for sign of the expected TIE fighters, but saw nothing. His hand went to drop the targeting visor into position, and for just a moment he hesitated. Then he swung it down in front of his eyes. "Watch yourselves," he ordered his companions. "What about the tower?" Wedge asked worriedly. "You worry about those fighters," Luke snapped. "I'll worry about the tower." They rushed on, closing on the target every second. Wedge stared upward, and his gaze suddenly froze. "Here they come. 0.3. Vader was setting his controls when one of his wingmen broke attack silence. "They're making their approach too fast. They'll never get out in time." "Stay with them," Vader commanded. "They're going too fast to get a fix," his other pilot announced with certainty. Vader studied several readouts and found that his sensors confirmed the other estimates. "They'll still have to slow down before they reach that tower." Luke contemplated the view in his targeting visor. Almost home. Seconds passed and the twin circlets achieved congruence. His finger convulsed on the firing control. "Torpedoes away! Pull up! Pull up!" Two powerful explosions rocked the trench, striking harmlessly far to one side of the minute opening. 3 TIE fighters shot out of the rapidly dissipating fireball, closing on the retreating rebels. "Take them," Vader ordered softly. Luke detected the pursuit at the same time as his companions. "Wedge, Biggs, split up. It's the only way we'll shake them." The 3 ships dropped toward the station, then abruptly raced off in 3 different directions. All 3 TIE fighters turned and followed Luke. Vader fired on the crazily dodging ship, missed, and frowned to himself. "The Force is strong with this one. I'll take care of him myself." Luke darted between defensive towers and wove a tight path around projecting docking bays, all to no avail. A single remaining TIE fighter stayed close behind. An energy bolt nicked one wing, close by an engine. It started to spark irregularly, threateningly. Luke fought to compensate and retain full control. Still trying to shake his persistent assailant, he dropped back into a trench again. I'm hit, he announced, but not too bad. R2, see what you can do with it. The tiny droid unlocked himself and moved to work on the damaged engine as energy bolts flashed by dangerously close. Hang on back there, Luke counseled the R2 unit as he worked a path around projecting towers, the fighter spinning and twisting tightly through the topography of the station. Fire remained intense as Luke randomly changed direction and speed. A series of indicators on the control panel slowly changed color. 3 vital gauges relaxed and returned where they belonged. I think you got it, R2, Luke told him gratefully. There, that's it. Just try to lock it down so I can't work loose again. R2 beeped in reply while Luke studied the whirling panorama behind and above them. I think we've lost those fighters, too. Blue Group, this is Blue 5. Are you clear? He manipulated several controls and the X-Wing shot out of the trench, still followed by emplacement fire. I'm up here waiting, boss, Wedge announced from his position high above the station. I can't see you. I'm on my way. Blue 3, are you clear? Biggs? I've had some trouble, his friend explained, but I think I lost him. Something showed again, damnably, on Biggs's screen. A glance behind showed the TIE fighter that had been chasing him for the past several minutes, dropping in once more behind him. He swung down toward the station again. Nope, not yet, Biggs told the others. Hold on, Luke, I'll be right there. A thin mechanical voice sounded over the speakers. Hang on, R2, hang on. Back at the temple headquarters, 3PO turned away from the curious human faces which had turned to stare at him. As Luke soared high above the station, another X-Wing swung in close to him. He recognized Wedge's ship and began hunting around anxiously for his friend. We're going in, Biggs. Join up. Biggs, are you all right? Biggs! There was no sign of the other fighter. Wedge, do you see him anywhere? Within the transparent canopy of the fighter bobbing close by, a helmeted head shook slowly. Nothing, Wedge told him over the communicator. Wait a little longer. He'll show. Luke looked around, worried, studied several instruments, and came to a decision. We can't wait. We gotta go now. I don't think he made it. Hey, you guys, a cheerful voice demanded to know. What are you waiting for? Luke turned sharply to his right in time to see another ship racing past and slowing slightly ahead of him. Don't ever give up on old Biggs, the intercom directed as the figure in the X-Wing ahead looked back at them. Within the central control room of the battle station, a harried officer rushed up to a figure studying the great battle screen and waved a handful of printouts at him. Sir, we've completed analysis of their attack plan. There is a danger. Should we break off the engagement or make plans to evacuate? Your ship is standing by. Governor Tarkin turned an incredulous gaze on the officer, who shrank back. Evacuate, he roared, at our moment of triumph? We are about to destroy the last remnants of the Alliance, and you call for evacuation? You overestimate their chances badly. Now get out. Overwhelmed by the governor's fury, the subdued officer turned and retreated from the room. We're going in, Luke declared as he commenced his dive toward the surface. Wedge and Biggs followed, just aft. Let's go, Luke. A voice he had heard before sounded inside his helmet. Again, he tapped his helmet and looked around. It sounded as if the speaker were standing just behind him, but there was nothing, only silent metal and nonverbal instrumentation. Puzzled, Luke turned back to his controls. Once more, energy bolts reached out for them, passing harmlessly on both sides as the surface of the battle station charged up into his face. But the defensive fire wasn't the cause of the renewed trembling Luke suddenly experienced. Several critical gauges were beginning their swing back into the danger zone again. He leaned toward the pickup. R2, those stabilizing elements must have broken loose again. See if you can't lock it back down. I've got to have full control. Ignoring the bumpy ride, the energy beams and explosions lighting space around him, the little robot moved to repair the damage. Additional, tireless explosions continued to buffet the 3 fighters as they dropped into the trench. Biggs and Wedge dropped behind to cover for Luke as he reached to pull down the targeting visor. For the second time, a peculiar hesitation swept through him. His hand was slower, yet, as he finally pulled the device down in front of his eyes, almost as if the nerves were in conflict with one another. As expected, the energy beam stopped as if on signal, and he was barreling down the trench unchallenged. Here we go again, Wedge declared as he spotted 3 Imperial fighters dropping down on them. Biggs and Wedge began crossing behind Luke, trying to draw the coming fire away from him and confuse their pursuers. One TIE fighter ignored the maneuvers, continuing to gain inexorably on the rebel ships. Luke stared into the targeting device, then reached up slowly to move it aside. For a long minute he pondered the deactivated instrument, staring at it as if hypnotized. Then he slid it sharply back in front of his face and studied the tiny screen as it displayed the shifting relationship of the X-Wing to the nearing exhaust port. "Hurry, Luke," Biggs called out as he wrenched his ship in time to narrowly avoid a powerful beam. "They're coming in faster this time. We can't hold them much longer." With inhuman precision, Darth Vader depressed the fire control of his fighter again. A loud, desperate sound shouted over the speakers, blending into a final agonized scream of flesh and metal as Biggs' fighter burst into a billion glowing splinters that rained down on the bottom of the trench. Wedge heard the explosion over his speakers and hunted frantically behind him for the trailing enemy ships. "We've lost Biggs," he yelled toward his own pickup. Luke didn't immediately reply. His eyes were watering, and he angrily wiped them clear. They were blurring his view of the targeting readout. "We're a couple of shooting stars, Biggs," he whispered huskily, "and we'll never be stopped." His ship rocked slightly from a near miss, and he directed his words to his remaining wingman, biting down hard at the end of each sentence. "Close it up, Wedge. We can't do any more good back there. R2, try to give me a little more power on our rear deflectors." The R2 unit hurried to comply as Wedge pulled up alongside Luke's ship. The trailing TIE fighters also increased their speed. "I'm on the leader," Vader informed his soldiers. "Take the other one." Luke flew in just in front of Wedge, slightly to port side. Energy bolts from the pursuing Imperials began to streak close about them. Both men crossed each other's path repeatedly, striving to present as confusing a target as possible. Wedge was fighting with his controls when several small flashes and sparks lit his control board. One small panel exploded, leaving molten slag behind. Somehow, he managed to retain control of the ship. "I got a bad malfunction, Luke. I can't stay with you." "Okay, Wedge, get clear." Wedge mumbled a heartfelt sorry and peeled up out of the trench. Vader, concentrating his attention on the one ship remaining before him, fired. Luke didn't see the near-lethal explosion which burst close behind him, nor did he have time to examine the smoking shell of twisted metal which now rode alongside one engine. The arms went limp on the little droid. All three TIE fighters continued to chase the remaining X-Wing down the trench. It was only a matter of moments before one of them caught the bobbing fighter with a crippling burst. Except now there were only two Imperials pursuing. The third had become an expanding cylinder of decomposing debris, bits and pieces of which slammed into the walls of the canyon. Vader's remaining wingman looked around in panic for the source of the attack. The same distortion fields that confused rebel instrumentation now did likewise to the two TIE fighters. Only when the freighter fully eclipsed the sun forward did the new threat become visible. It was a Corellian transport, far larger than any fighter, and it was diving directly at the trench. But it didn't move precisely like a freighter somehow. Whoever was piloting that vehicle must have been unconscious or out of his mind, the wingman decided. Wildly, he adjusted controls in an attempt to avoid the anticipated collision. The freighter swept by just overhead, but in missing it, the wingman slid too far to one side. A small explosion followed as two huge fins of the paralleling TIE fighters intersected. Screaming uselessly into his pickup, the wingman fluttered toward the near trench wall. He never touched it, his ship erupting in flame before contact. To the other side, Darth Vader's fighter began spinning helplessly. Unimpressed by the Dark Lord's desperate glower, various controls and instruments gave back readings which were brutally truthful. Completely out of control, the tiny ship continued spinning in the opposite direction from the destroyed wingman, out into the endless reaches of deep space. Whoever was at the controls of the supple freighter was neither unconscious nor insane. Well, perhaps slightly touched, but fully in command nonetheless. It soared high above the trench, turning to run protectively above Luke. "You're all clear now, kid," a familiar voice informed him. "Now blow this thing so we can all go home." This pep talk was followed by a reinforcing grunt which could have only been produced by a particularly large Wookiee. Luke looked up through the canopy and smiled, but his smile faded as he turned back to the targeting visor. There was a tickling inside his head. "Luke, trust me." the tickle requested, forming words for the third time. He stared into the targeter. The emergency exhaust port was sliding toward the firing circle again, as it had once before, when he'd missed. He hesitated, but only briefly this time, then shoved the targeting screen aside. Closing his eyes, he appeared to mumble to himself, as if in internal conversation with something unseen. With the confidence of a blind man in familiar surroundings, Luke moved a thumb over several controls, then touched one. Soon after, a concerned voice filled the cockpit from the open speakers. "Base 1 to Blue 5, your targeting device is switched off. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Luke murmured, barely audible. "Nothing." He blinked and cleared his eyes. Had he been asleep? Looking around, he saw that he was out of the trench and shooting back into open space. A glance outside showed the familiar shape of Han Solo's ship shadowing him. Another at the control board indicated that he had released his remaining torpedoes, although he couldn't remember touching the firing stud. Still, he must have. The cockpit speakers were alive with excitement. "You did it! You did it!" Wedge was shouting over and over. "I think they went right in." "Good shot, kid," Solo complimented him, having to raise his voice to be heard over Chewbacca's unrestrained howling. Distant, muted rumblings shook Luke's ship, an omen of incipient success. He must have fired the torpedoes. Mustn't he? Gradually, he regained his composure. "Glad you were here to see it. Now let's get some distance between us and that thing before it goes. I hope Wedge was right." Several X-Wings, Y-Wings, and one battered-looking freighter accelerated away from the battle station, racing toward the distant curve of Yavin. Behind them, small flashes of fading light marked the receding station. Without warning, something appeared in the sky in place of it, which was brighter than the glowing gas giant, brighter than its far-off sun. For a few seconds, the eternal night became day. No one dared look directly at it. Not even multiple shields set on high could dim that awesome flare. Space filled temporarily with trillions of microscopic metal fragments, propelled past the retreating ships by the liberated energy of a small artificial sun. The collapsed residue of the battle station would continue to consume itself for several days, forming for that brief span of time the most impressive tombstone in this corner of the cosmos. 13. A cheering, gleeful throng of technicians, mechanics, and other inhabitants of the Alliance headquarters swarmed around each fighter as it touched down and taxied into the temple hangar. Several of the other surviving pilots had already vacated their ships and were waiting to greet Luke. On the opposite side of the fighter, the crowd was far smaller and more restrained. It consisted of a couple of technicians and one tall, humanoid droid who watched worriedly as the humans mounted the scorched fighter and lifted a badly burned metal hulk from its back. "Oh my! R2?" 3PO pleaded, bending close to the carbonized robot. "Can you hear me? Say something." His unwinking gaze turned to one of the techs. "You can repair him, can't you?" "We'll do our best." The man studied the vaporized metal, the dangling components. "He's taken a terrible beating." "You must repair him! Sir, if any of my circuits or modules will help, I'll gladly donate them." They moved slowly away, oblivious to the noise and excitement around them. Between robots and the humans who repaired them, there existed a very special relationship. Each partook a little of the other, and sometimes the dividing line between man and machine was more blurred than many would admit. The center of the carnival atmosphere was formed by three figures who battled to see who would compliment the others the most. When it came to congratulatory backslapping, however, Chewbacca won by default. There was laughter as the Wookiee looked embarrassed at having nearly flattened Luke in his eagerness to greet him. "I knew you'd come back," Luke was shouting. "I just knew it. I would have been nothing but dust if you hadn't sailed in like that, Han." Solo had lost none of his smug self-assurance. "Well, I couldn't very well let a flying farm boy go up against that station all by himself. Besides, I was beginning to realize what could happen, and I felt terrible about it, Luke, leaving you to maybe take all the credit and get all the reward." As they laughed, a lithe figure, robes flowing, rushed up to Luke in a very unsenatorial fashion. "You did it, Luke! You did it!" Leia was shouting. She fell into his arms and hugged him as he spun her around. Then she moved to Solo and repeated the embrace. Expectedly, the Corellian was not quite as embarrassed. Suddenly awed by the adulation of the crowd, Luke turned away. He gave the tired fighter a look of approval, then found his gaze traveling upward, up to the ceiling high overhead. For a second, he thought he heard something faintly like a gratified sigh, a relaxing of muscles a crazy old man had once performed in moments of pleasure. Of course, it was probably the intruding hot wind of a steaming jungle world, but Luke smiled anyway at what he thought he saw up there. There were many rooms in the vast expanse of the temple which had been converted for modern service by the technicians of the Alliance. Even in their desperate need, however, there was something too clean and classically beautiful about the ruins of the ancient throne room for the architects to modify. They had left it as it was, save for scouring it clear of creeping jungle growth and debris. For the first time in thousands of years, that spacious chamber was full. Hundreds of rebel troops and technicians stood assembled on the old stone floor, gathered together for one last time before dispersing to new posts and distant homes. For the first time ever the massed ranks of pressed uniforms and polished semi-armor stood arrayed together in a fitting show of alliance might. The banners of the many worlds which had lent support to the rebellion fluttered in the gentle breeze formed inside. At the far end of a long open aisle stood a vision gowned in formal white, barred with Chelindoni waves, Leia Organa's signet of office. Several figures appeared at the far end of the aisle. One, massive and hirsute, showed signs of running for cover, but was urged on down the open row by his companion. It took several minutes for Luke, Han, Chewie, and 3PO to cover the distance to the other end. They stopped before Leia, and Luke recognized General Dodonna among the other dignitaries seated nearby. There was a pause, and a gleaming, familiar R2 unit joined the group, moving to stand next to a thoroughly awestruck 3PO. Chewbacca shuffled nervously, giving every indication of wishing he were someplace else. Solo silenced him as Leia rose and came forward. At the same time, banners tilted in unison, and all those gathered in the great hall turned to face the dais. She placed something heavy and golden around Solo's neck, then Chewbacca's, having to strain to do so, and finally around Luke's. Then she made a signal to the crowd, and the rigid discipline dissolved as every man, woman, and mechanical present was permitted to give full vent to their feelings. As he stood awash in the cheers and shouts, Luke found that his mind was neither on his possible future with the Alliance nor on the chance of traveling adventurously with Han Solo and Chewbacca. Instead, unlikely as Solo had claimed it to be, he found his full attention occupied by the radiant Leia Organa. She noticed his unabashed stare, but this time she only smiled. This has been Star Wars: A New Hope, formerly titled Star Wars from the Adventures of Luke Skywalker, by George Lucas. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed my reading of this audiobook and would like to contribute, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/theexpandeduniverse lives forever. The link is also in the video's description.